Okay, that's fine.
Okay, recording.
All right, please join me in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father God, I thank you for this opportunity to talk to my brother about Calvinism and open theism. And God, I just ask that you would allow this conversation to be cordial and edifying, and allow it to be an example of how Christians can love each other and disagree and discuss things and just show the world in the body of Christ that we don't have to be nasty, we don't have to be mean, but we can act like Christians who are redeemed by your blood and saved by your work. In Jesus' name, amen.
Excellent, excellent. So, James, tell us a little bit about yourself. So, I need to get to know you. You're my new best friend, and so gotta know my new best friend.
So, I've been a Christian for several years now. I was saved at 15 years old. Came over to Reformed theology a couple years later through discussions with my father and wrestling through that whole issue. I am married. I have 4 kids.
Good,
I also,
nice.
uh, yeah, they keep me busy. They're from 6, and then I have a 5-year-old about to be 5, and then 3, and then 1, 4 kids in all, and three boys, 1 girl. So wonderful blessings from the Lord to me. I also graduated from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I serve as a pastoral assistant at my local church. And so I try to balance all of that. Try to balance serving my family. Try to balance serving my local church, often teaching and preaching there, and then try to also have discussions with other Christians on theological positions and just try to understand where they're coming from, whether that be relationism or Reformed theology with Leighton Flowers, and then or open theism. All of these various topics interest me because just that's my heart is to be a teacher and just trying to understand the truth of God.
Yeah, everything you said sounds great. I'm Chris Fisher. You can call me Chris or Christopher, whichever you prefer. A lot of people, they just know me by shorthand by Heretic. No, I was just joking. They don't call me that. Not to my face. But I got 6 kids, and so you're probably a little bit younger than me, so you got time to catch up. So you got to
That's right.
pump up those numbers a little bit there.
We
So
have to.
yeah, we do have to. We do have to. Gotta get some more babies out there. That's how we're gonna, populate America, make
Yeah,
America Christian again.
or just spread the gospel, be fruitful and multiply, right?
Yeah, I know it. And so, yeah, I've been doing my podcast for I don't know, like 2 or 3 years now. So I got like hundreds of hours of me talking. Some people have listened to them all. I don't know how they could stand me that much, but good times. So I'm an open theist. An open theist. I don't know how much you know about open theism. Do you know anything about open theism?
General idea of open theism. I would be curious to kind of understand, where you're coming from, and also I would be interested to know how did you become an open theist, or what was that journey for you like?
What was that journey for me? So my dad, he used to be a staunch Calvinist, and he moved to Denver, and he needed some Greek lessons, and so he was in his local or his local Bible shop, Bible Christian bookstore, and he asked the girl at the counter. He says, I'm looking for some free Greek lessons, and she's like, well, my dad teaches Greek, and he says, well, how much does he charge for that? And she's like, it's free, and he's like,
Mhm.
that's my price. And so he started going to that, and he started interacting with Bob Hill. And Bob Hill was a Greek teacher out of Derby Bible Church in Denver, Colorado. And he was an open theist, this Greek teacher. And my dad was, staunch Calvinist or whatever, and converted to open theism. So I grew up my whole life basically being an open theist, being taught Greek and Latin and Hebrew when I was a kid. Not that I'm a Latin or Hebrew or Greek scholar or anything. I think I mentioned to you a little bit before. That stuff kind of goes away as you get older. You're really deep into it, and then it just kind of phases out. So I probably need to spin back up on that some a little bit. But yeah, so it's good. I grew up a Christian, grew up in Denver, Colorado, and kind of South Dakota too, kind of a mix between the two. But yeah, like weekly Bible studies, like twice weekly Bible studies, and all sorts of good stuff.
Yeah,
So
that's fascinating.
Yeah, I was introduced very early on. I've spent my whole life in Calvinist churches, and so it's like I'm surrounded by people who dislike me or yell at me. I remember one story. I was at Summit Ministries, Colorado, and I was on this bus defending open theism. I'm surrounded by maybe like 7 or 8 people, all just trying to yell their points at me at the same time. It's like I'm sitting here just trying to defend myself. It's good times. It works.
That's wonderful. It's really interesting. You have an interesting story there because it sounds like your foundation was open theism. You weren't kind of, coming out of Calvinism, coming out of Arminianism. It sounds like you just organically were taught this by your fathers, growing
Yeah,
up.
so my father really focused on concepts such as omniscience, where God doesn't necessarily know every single aspect of the future in any definitive sense. Like traditional omniscience states that God knows propositions as true or false about the future, inherently ungenerated in himself from eternity. Open theism would reject that category of thought that God learns things through observation or God knows through his actions. I know what I'm going to do, that type of thing. So there's different ways, mechanisms which God gains information. So this type of omniscience, I guess, was taught to me from a young age. But other concepts, like when I started talking to my dad about, most of the church believes in things like omnipresence. God is in every square inch of every place on earth. And my dad was very open to just letting me explore it for myself. I said, hey, one day after church, they were talking about omnipresence. I came to my dad and I was like, Dad, where's the biblical defense for this idea? So he just goes down to the bookshelf, he pulls out a systematic theology and he hands it to me. And I look at the evidence and it's really not there. It's not there. So if very early, I guess, I've questioned a lot of these things that we're taught, which don't necessarily have biblical support. So first and foremost, I would consider myself a biblicalist, someone who cares about the biblical evidence, someone who wants the data and wants to believe what the data says rather than what tradition tells us. The Bible over tradition. I hope that resonates with you. I hope that's your
Yeah,
idea and approach to Scripture as
I mean,
well.
I'm a biblicist as well. That I ultimately will follow the data wherever it goes. With that being said, I also believe that the Bible does teach that the Holy Spirit will lead His church into all truth, and I also believe that the Bible also teaches that God has gifted His church with teachers and preachers and all of these things. And so, with that in mind, while it is theoretically possible that the church could have got something wrong from the very beginning, I would say it's more likely not the case than is the case, right? And I think just we all should have a suspicion of newer doctrines wherever they come, and someone saying, listen to me, I'm coming out from the desert 600 years after Christ. Everything before me is wrong. Come listen to me, right? Or someone else coming in America saying the same thing. And we've seen this time and time again. And, I always say everyone thinks that they're Martin Luther, but 99% of the people are not Martin Luther. They're the heretic.
Yeah.
And I don't say that to say that you're a heretic. I'm just saying I'm cautioning to say, while I'm willing to go where the scripture goes, I would say the majority of the time people are actually deviating from what the scripture teaches and what the Holy Spirit has led his church to believe, and not discovering new truth. But I am open to say, if you're saying this is a biblical argument, let's go to the Bible, because, ultimately, if the church has deviated, I don't want to follow them into the ditch,
Yeah.
right? And it really, though, it can't be that big of a ditch. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's doubtfully a huge ditch.
So
But
so you're
nevertheless,
not
I want to believe the Bible.
you're not a Catholic, are you?
No, no, I'm certainly not a Catholic. But
S-
even Catholicism, I think it's a wrong reading of Catholicism to think that since the earliest church, that all of the church was teaching this, and then it was somehow rediscovered by Martin Luther hundreds and 1600 years later. I think that's a wrong reading, and I think if we go back to Martin Luther and the Reformers, they were pointing to pre reformers and pre-teachers, saying, no, 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 the Catholic Church has encrusted and changed what these previous teachers were teaching and what we find in the Bible. So they
yeah.
weren't just saying scripture alone, forget everyone else. They were saying scripture and these other guys have been teaching this, and we've gone off course.
So I would make very similar claims to that. The Catholic Church ruled for 10,000 years, right? 10,000 years of of. I'm sorry. Let me change that real quick. The Catholic Church ruled for thousands of years, right? A couple thousand years of complete dominance of the church, and then the reformers had to break away from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm granting that. So I'm saying that that can happen. It can be the case that the church can be encrusted with false doctrine and little by little, right, swerve off of the truth, which I think is exactly what happened in the Reformation, is that people started adding one little thing after another. And if you do that, eventually, hundreds of years later, you start getting really far off, right? So
Right.
one example would be that the saints, the believers, were honoring the martyrs. That didn't seem that dangerous at first. The honor martyrs, well, why not, right? These people sacrificed and sacrificed for Jesus. We should honor them. All of a sudden, though, this honoring them slips into relics and slips into now they're basically worshiping these martyrs. It didn't start that way, and we're not finding that in the scripture, but it was a slow progression. So I'm agreeing with you
Yeah.
in principle that whatever the Bible teaches, I'm going to go.
So one of the things I
That
do on my
we
channel. Oh, I'm sorry. You kind of broke up, so
no
I
no
thought
that's
you
fine.
had stopped there, and so I was interjecting. One of the things I do on my channel is I delve into early church history. I look at Augustine, I look at Origen of Alexandria, I look at Clement of Alexandria, and we trace the Neoplatonic roots of a lot of these teachings. Like in Augustine, in the Confessions, he admits that the Bible was absurd until he read it in light of Platonism. When he had to take it at face value, that's when he rejected the Bible because it was all nonsense to him. And it's not until he was able to get this super secret spiritual reading of it that he started accepting the Bible. And we see those stems of Christian history throughout the early church fathers, where they're having to spiritualize the text in order to accept it.
Yeah. Again, I wouldn't be surprised. The fact that everyone is a creature of their environment, right? So a lot today, we're dealing with inclusivism and pluralism and feminism and anti-creation views and evolution. And so it's not really that surprising that all of a sudden people are finding, the Bible is compatible with all of these things now. I mean, that shouldn't surprise us at all. So no, it doesn't surprise me per se that you have a Greek philosophical thought and people steeped into that philosophy and then going to the scripture already presupposing that and then bringing that out of the text. So no, that wouldn't surprise
Yeah.
me per se. But again, I'm just saying in general though, and I think this is pretty much all, not all, but many people will say this. Generally, we do believe that the church, God has been leading His church, and I'm generally opposed to the idea of here in 2019 we're supposed to lead a revolution to go and conquer all of the churches back with pure theology that they lost from the time of the apostles, you know, uh, 2,000 years ago. Generally, I think, no, we're wrapping up history here, and we need to continue to spread the gospel and not try to go re-evangelize all the churches that are already there. But again,
I,
I'm willing to go into the biblical data.
I'm willing to argue that most Christians are open theists when you talk to them. Until you actually ask them if they're open theists, they'll pray like the future's open. They'll pray like God listens to their prayers, generally responds, generally a genuine give and take relationship. They don't pray like the future's set. They don't act like the future is all decided meticulously. So I would say your normal average layman is practically an open theist already.
It's interesting. I would agree with you in the point that the average layman Christian, including myself, pray and act as if the past is the past and the present's the present and the future is yet to come. Right. I would say the vast majority of people act that way. I would dispute though that I would say the average Christian, if you ask them, the vast majority of all Christians, you say, does God know the future? Does God know the future with absolute precision? They would say, yes, He does. And so while I agree with you that people treat the future as open, which I do myself, I don't think that makes them open theists. Open theism is a specific claim about God's knowledge. And I did want to ask you about this. you were talking about open theism and conceptions of God's omniscience. I remember you
Hmm.
saying that. And one of the things I immediately picked up is that you used the word omniscience, but then in that same breath, you were talking about God growing and gaining in knowledge.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to you, how do you take this? Is God merely gaining knowledge of the future, or is God gaining knowledge of the past and the present? I mean, how far do you take this God gaining knowledge?
So first about semantics, so what the word omniscience means. There's different ways to take omniscience. Omniscience could be if you're dealing with an ancient Semitic religion and there's an all-knowing God, and that God knows things through sight. You could call it an omniscient God, even though the omniscience doesn't function as the theologians claim. So a God who gains most all knowledge on earth through visual means, not necessarily knows everything. That word can apply to that situation. It doesn't have to for the sake of this conversation. Most open theists affirm a dynamic omniscience, that God knows all possible truths that are possibly to be known, and future truths aren't truths to be known. And so,
Okay.
as propositions come into existence, then God gains access to those propositions. And then there's the classical definition of omniscience, which God knows all true propositions and he can't grow in knowledge. He doesn't gain any new propositions on top of his proposition set, as we would say. And so that's the
Yeah.
classical definition of omniscience.
So where do you go ahead? I'm sorry.
Oh, I would say that the biblical data leads us to believe that omniscience is not inherent in God, that God it's not identical with him. Most of the passages in the Bible that talk about how God knows things, it's God sitting in heaven and he watches the ways of man. Or God goes to, in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, he goes to find out events about the past. And so there's models of omniscience that support this as well. There's actually an interesting open theist book that just came out that's called God's Presence in the God's Absence in the Charismatic Presence, which argues that God is it's a philosophical argument, that God is so repulsed by sin that his presence and his knowledge of places withdraws as they become more sinful, because he's holy and he's repelled by that. That's a philosophical take. I'm not saying I take that position, but it is a model that's out there in the acceptable models of omniscience that open theists ascribe to.
So I'm just wanted some clarity here, because you gave, and I appreciate that you gave a lot there. It sounds like, especially with the Sodom and Gomorrah example, it sounds like you're taking a more radical position of simply saying that God doesn't know the future, but it sounds like you're taking that Sodom and Gomorrah incident pretty literally, where God actually has to physically show
Mm.
up to a location in a physical body and to find out if they've been committing previous sins. So is that what you're saying? That there are certain things even about the past that God doesn't know, and he has to go investigate, kind of like a historian, and kind of figure out, well, if they're doing these sins now, they probably have been doing these sins in the past, which I've been getting reports by people praying or whatever. I mean, am
Uh,
I caricaturing the position, or is that what you're saying?
Yeah, sort of. I wouldn't say that God has to investigate in a body. That would be a presupposition on the text. I'm just saying we have this incident in which God doesn't know in detail. He knows generally what's happened in the past. And there's Jewish scholarship who say that God has omniscience in a general sense and not a specific sense. And so he goes and verifies what he already knows through either angels or he visits himself. Not necessarily that he had to use that methodology in order to gain that knowledge, but we do have that data point in the Bible, which he is trying to gather knowledge about the past, and
Okay.
however that works out.
Yeah, I mean, I will commend you that that is radically consistent. That I'm yeah, that I mean, I will commend you on that. That you are taking these scriptures pretty much at face value, to the point where you're saying that God has to investigate past events. I'm curious then, when it comes to the incident with God and Adam, when God says, "Did you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil?" Or when he's saying, "Where are you, Adam?" Are you suggesting that God did not actually know whether Adam had eaten of the tree, or he didn't actually know where Adam was when he said those things?
That's one possibility. And so when language is flexible and narratives don't necessarily describe all possibilities that explain those narratives. When God's talking to Adam, it could be something like a known answer question. It could be that it's one possibility. God knows the answer. God knows, I know where you've been. Now I'm asking you in order to find out if you're going to fess up. Like if I ask my kids, did you clean your room? And I know they didn't clean their room. My purpose in asking that known answer question is to see if they respond truthfully or not. It could be that.
Yeah.
It could also be divine nescience. He might not know where they are. He could just be my kids. I went over this passage with my kids, and there's some reversals of fortunes going on. He says, "The day you eat of it, you shall die," and that doesn't happen. So you could take that. Well, did God not know this was going to happen and show divine mercy? Was he lying? Was this a spiritual death? There's different ways to take that, and that's one of the various options for it. I would say that it's not necessarily divine nescience. It's probably the known answer question.
Okay. So what you would say, though, that you're not, at least in this incident, you're not taking necessarily the face value. You're kind of explaining it through some other means of explanation. And so at least in this case, you wouldn't just take the plain, what the so-called plain literal meaning of the text. And so if that's the case here,
it doesn't really claim in Genesis 3 that it doesn't give commentary of whether or not God actually knows where Adam was at this time when he's asking this. Like, for example, in Job, when the Satan, the adversary, approaches God and he says, "Where have you been?" And the Satan says, "Oh, going to and fro." He said, "I've been traveling around." It's not sure. We're not sure what's going on there. Is that legitimately a question to gain knowledge of what the adversary has been doing? Or is this some sort of rhetorical strategy to get the Satan to admit to something? The text is not explicit. And so when texts aren't explicit, you have to look at the range of possible interpretations for those texts and rate them by what probability of the interpretation there is.
No, I definitely would agree with you, but I would just take those principles that you're using there, and I would apply it to some of the other scriptures, such as Genesis 6 and some, that would be a famous example, or again, with the case of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I would imagine, I'm not too familiar with the open theists, but I would imagine that many open theists also would agree with me on, at least with God showing up to Sodom and trying to investigate and figure out if these things are the case. I think most people would say this is not, this shouldn't be taken literal, but this is a rhetorical device describing God and trying to communicate something to us in human terms of an anthropomorphism, as we can think of it, or even anthropopathism. So I'm agreeing with, I like your ability to understand rhetoric and language and possible meanings, but I would just say then, why can't we apply that same criteria to these scriptures and at least say, well, this other classical interpretation or interpretation that is compatible with a classical view of omniscience is also possible, and we need to synthesize all the data to figure out which one's most likely.
I think because in Genesis 18, you have data points that are not present in Genesis 3. If Genesis 3 said, "I don't know where you are, Adam, and I'm trying to figure that out," then you'd have to default with divine nescience, that God just doesn't know where Adam is. But that's not present in Genesis 3. But we do find it present in Genesis 18. I got it pulled up. We'll switch to the ESV because I like the ESV for the Old Testament. And he says, this is the Lord talking, and he's talking either to himself or he's talking to angels. And he says, because the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. And so it reads pretty explicitly like the purpose of this fact-finding mission is to figure out if the rumors which have come to him, and this is a very common concept in Semitic religions, where you have a divine council, and the angels hear our prayers, and they bring our prayers to God. And so you'll find texts like in Exodus, in which the cries of the Israelite slaves, it reaches God. In Jonah, it says that the cries of Nineveh's oppressions, they reach God. And it's this idea that there's communication that's being filtered to God, and then God acts on that information that's been brought to him, maybe by an angelic messenger. And so he has to verify things that happened in the past. Some open theists say, well, he's going to verify if they're going to continue like this in the future. He's going to give them another chance, which possibly could be an interpretation, but it's not that. It seems fairly explicit, like this is a verification of past events.
Yeah, I mean, well, I would say that well, I certainly agree that the language is being applied is treating the Lord as simple, basically as a human being who would have to go down and physically verify information. But to me, this is just very difficult, if not impossible to, maybe impossible too strong, but very improbable to apply this literally to God. Because as you pointed out, okay, let's say God doesn't somehow doesn't isn't everywhere and doesn't even know everything that happened in the past or in the present. Well, certainly he could send his angels to go down there and to find it out, or somehow he got this report in the first place. I mean, are we really going to believe that he actually needs to physically show up to locations, figure out if people are doing something? I mean, even the book of Revelation and Daniel describes that there are these books, that everything we've done has been recorded in these books, and one day we'll be judged based on what's in those books. And then Jesus says, every idle word that you speak, you will give an account. Well, how does Jesus know God know every idle word that we have spoken, if not it's in the book? So these books are being recorded. So why does God have to physically show up to a location and investigate when he has these angels who are seeing and recording everything that we do, if that's not even a picture itself of God's omniscience? So I'm just saying that it just seems that this is beyond just God not knowing the future. Now we have God extremely limited, where he actually needs to physically show up to locations and investigate whether things are happening. And we don't find this anywhere else in the Bible. I mean, where else do we have God having to show up and write things down to figure out, well, really, were these people what they thought?
Malachi 3. Okay, so Malachi 3 is famous for people using it for an immutability proof text, but they tend to stop there and not read the end a couple verses. What's going on in Malachi 3 is you have a group of righteous people, and the righteous people are worried that when God comes back and he judges the world and he judges the wicked, that he will accidentally judge them as well. Their righteousness will not register with God. They do not believe. They do not believe these righteous individuals who are God-fearers. They do not believe that God has omniscience of the past. And so what God does to subvert their fears is he writes a divine book with their names in it, such that when he comes back and judges Israel or judges these people, he doesn't accidentally judge them as well.
Yeah, I'm familiar with this passage. I don't think that that's actually what's going on. I think even if you look at verse 14, there are people who said it is vain to serve God. What is the profit of keeping his charge or walking in the morning before the Lord? It's saying this is pointless. Like, what's the reason to serve God? Here I am serving God, and I'm better off than the guy who's not serving God. You know, and vice versa. There seems to be no profit at all. Is all completely vain. And then even verse 15. And now we call the arrogant blessed, and evildoers not only prosper, but they put God to the test and they escape. So we clearly see on earth now, judgment is not meting out. This is pointless. And then verse 16 says, then those who feared the Lord spoke with one another. So these people are saying it's vain, but believers are speaking with one another. And it says the Lord paid attention and heard them, and a book of remembrance was written before him for those who feared and esteemed his name.
What's the purpose of the book? What function does the book alleviate fears? How does this book function?
Well, one, we're not even sure if and I would say probably not, that this is something that's happening in heaven. So no one knows of this until Malachi is writing this down and informing us. But the idea is that God is putting this book of remembrance. And so even though these people will pass off the scene, and that's what they're saying in Malachi 3:15, nothing's happening here on earth right now. And so the whole point of the book of remembrance is that these people are going to be remembered, and one day the fortunes will be restored and changed, right? And that's going to happen at the resurrection and at the final judgment. So no, I wouldn't take this. I'm not sure if you would take this. I mean, I'll ask you, do you think that an actual physical book was being written down and people's names were being having to be actually written down so that God wouldn't forget when he's resurrecting all people that, oh, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys.
Oh, book has a wide semantic range. It could be just a record. God's creating a record of those individuals. Maybe some divine record, maybe some divine scroll. It doesn't have to be physical, but it seems to be that these people, they're fearing the Lord, and they come together, and they're talking among one another. And it says the Lord paid attention. Oh, he hears them. Then a book of remembrance was written before him of those who fear the Lord and esteem his name. So it looks like this book is in reaction. It's reacting to these people's their murmur, their conversation, and it's doing something to alleviate their possible fears. That seems to be the function of the book.
I guess. I mean, I don't really see them knowing this. I think the function of this passage in the scriptures is to answer the charge of 15, namely that all things it's pointless to serve God, and saying no, it's not. And in fact, those who don't have that attitude, namely those who fear the Lord, right, those believers who speak to each other, that's all of us, right, who say no, these people are not telling the truth. There will be one day God's recompense coming. It's those people that God is telling us in this passage through anthropomorphism and just human language. Hey, these people are being recorded. God hears what you're saying, and they will be remembered when that second coming happens. But again, I would say, I mean, this passage is only, again, suggesting what I'm saying about the Sodom and Gomorrah incident. It doesn't say he has to show up and physically hear what they're saying. He's already there. He already can hear, and he's already recording what these people are saying and writing their names down. So I just wouldn't take this overly literal.
That seems to spiritualize what appears to me to be historical narrative. There's different genres in the Bible, I'll grant you. It seems like Genesis 18 and Malachi, the end part of Malachi 3, they tend to seem more historical to me. These are events that actually happened rather than symbolic events. Do you think that this conversation in Genesis 18 actually happened between God and himself, or God and the angels, about going to verify Sodom and Gomorrah? Or is that language for our benefit? If it is for our benefit, what does it mean? What kind of benefit do we gain from that language?
Yeah, so I'd have to look back at that Genesis 18 passage in detail to know if there's evidence that God, I mean, does it say in that, and I don't remember offhand, is he saying that to Abraham? Was this, who's speaking? Is it God speaking? Is it just kind of being narrated? What's going on there? But regardless, whether or not God is actually saying this to Abraham, or whether the narrator is recording this, I think the idea is that God is verifying and confirming, just like a regional Lord would, that the Sodomites are in fact wicked. Yes, he knows that they are wicked, and the judgment comes down upon them. So that's the general picture of God being viewed as a sovereign Lord who makes sure that he has all the facts before he enacts his judgment, which is good, right? I mean, the worst thing we would want is a sovereign Lord who just acts rashly. Oh, I heard reports that these people are being wicked, so I just went and wiped them out. Well, what if you find out that they weren't actually as wicked as you knew? And so that's being distanced from God, and God's being pictured in this anthropomorphic way. But
so what kind of truths like, for example, idioms, metaphors, figures of speech, they communicate some sort of information. We're able to make this parallel and derive benefit from it. So in what way is God going to verify to see if the reports are true? And how does that line up with reality such that we can get something from that? Just in the sense of his sovereignty?
Yeah, I would say the main thing that, if this passage correctly, I would say the thing that we see from this illustration is, number one, God's not afraid to use human language to himself. And I think that this is extremely helpful. Not only is God not afraid to use human language applied to himself, but he's also not afraid to take on a physical body and enact these things out in reality. And that's extremely helpful, because Jews and Muslims say God would never do that. He's completely so above all of this that he would never ever apply human language to himself, and he would never come down as man. He's too high and above humanity for that. And this is why the incarnation is impossible for them. But here we have in the book of Genesis, God saying, I'm not afraid to use human language. I'm not afraid to relate to you humans, as you can understand in human terminology. And so I would say that this is wonderful preparation of the people of God for the incarnation. But the main theological significance of this, I don't think, is to communicate that God is ignorant of the past, or that God actually physically needs to show up to locations to find out information. I think the main point is that God is a sovereign Lord who functions in a way analogous to a Lord finding out information, confirming, and then bringing judgment. And I'll give you another interesting example in the book of Genesis. Is the Tower of Babel. They're creating this Tower of Babel that's supposed to be high in the heavens, and the Lord comes down to see the tower. I mean, the Lord actually shows up to see the tower, and this is very funny in many respects. They're building a tower into the heaven, and the Lord from heaven can't see it. Are we going to say he literally cannot see the tower? Of course not. He can see things way beneath the tower, right? If he can't see tower length, he can't see very much at all. He's more than just ignorant. He's half blind in some respects, right? But the idea is just playing off this terminology is that this thing's supposed to be so high, but the Lord has to actually come down to see this puny thing. So it's punny. It's funny. That's supposed to be being communicated here. But the main thing I would say is this is preparing the people of God for the incarnation, saying God is not afraid to communicate himself in human language, and he's especially not afraid to actually one day incarnate himself as a person.
So one thing about the Tower of Babel incident, language could work like that. It could be punny like that. It could be communicating those truths. It also could be literal. That's something we can't necessarily rule out. I don't think there's anything in the text that forcibly rules out that interpretation. And so when dealing with the Bible or any text, it would be a mistake to try to read our own theology onto the text rather than to look for textual clues as to if the text is to be taken literally, if it's supposed to be taken idiomatically. So here's a question to you. How could Genesis 18 be written in such a way that it would communicate to you that God is verifying things about the past?
Well, I mean, I would say, again, I'm not afraid to admit that taken at face value, if you read the Bible as if you never knew any theology, never knew anything about God, I would agree with you that this would. But I'd also think that God is a semi-Superman like being, and I'd also, let me ask you this: do you think that God has a physical body and physical arms and legs and walks around? Would you take, essentially like a Mormon view? And I'm not caricature. I really want to know this because I'm not sure. Would you hold to that God has a physical body like humanity?
So Benjamin Summer, he's a Jewish scholar, and he writes about divine fragmentation. It's not that God has a body. God has multiple diverse bodies in sundry locations at the same time. God has bodily fluidity. That's more of a semi-category than discrete bodies. Discrete bodies is more of a Greco-Roman concept. And so, you see Yahweh actually interact in the Genesis 18 text. And Benjamin Summer points out, we don't know whether 1, 2, or 3 of these beings in Genesis 18 is Yahweh. Angels and Yahweh are regularly, the same term is used. Who does Jacob wrestle with? Does he wrestle with an angel, or does he wrestle with Yahweh? Angel is a category that includes Yahweh. He's of that class. And so I think God has multiple bodies, not that he necessarily has to have a body, and not necessarily that body has to be physical. You see more of like an energy body in some passages in which God sits on top of Mount Sinai and burns the top of it with some sort of energy body. And then Moses, there's an interesting passage where Moses asks to see God's face, and it reads historical to me. It reads like it's trying to be serious, where he says, no one can see my face and live. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this thing where I cover you with my hand, and then I pass by, and then you can see my backside. And it's a very strange text. I think it's best understood through those Semitic categories where God can have diverse bodies of diverse substances if God so wants.
Yeah, a couple of things you said that piqued my interest. One, you said that angels were in the same class of being as God. I want to get a little clarity on that. Are you affirming polytheism? Are you affirming that? Are we denying that God has a deity? God is the creator-creature distinction. God is the creator of all things, and he's unique in that sense, or is God one of many spiritual beings? Maybe he's the most powerful, but he's one of many spiritual beings that have some kind of, of the same race, of the same class, as you use the language, kind of like multiple different human beings or multiple different kinds of animals, right? It can be different classes of animals, one canine and so forth, and a dog and a feline, all that. But how would you explain kind of that comment?
For example, when Saul calls up Elijah from the medium, and the medium sees Samuel coming up, and she says, "Look, there's an Elohim." And so Samuel is described as an Elohim when he's in ghost form. The Elohim, the angels are referred to as Elohim. The Elohim seems to be a class of beings which are divine, which God fits in that category, although he's species unique, as Michael Heiser would say. It's not that he's in the divine realm, but there's no creature like him, but it's still a category that he fits into. So I'm not claiming polytheism or anything like that. I'm not saying there's multiple gods. There's multiple beings that we can call gods. There's the demons that Paul says that the pagans they sacrifice to demons. There's the gods of Egypt that Yahweh punishes when he inflicts inflicts the plagues on Egypt. So there's other divine beings that we see in the Bible that sometimes there's a war going on, and who was it? Ezekiel's praying, and an angel appears to him and says, "Oh, I was delayed because I was in war against the prince of Syria," which is some sort of divine adversary to the God's soldiers, God's angels.
Yeah, so I don't have any problem with understanding that there are angelic beings out there, and there are bad angel beings, or there's multiple spiritual beings, right? That even us, when we die and we're in the intermediate state, we're spiritual beings, just like or similar to angels and demons and all of that. I guess I'm just trying to get clarity. Let me just ask you this: Is God the self-existent necessary being that is the creator of all things?
Well, a lot of those are Platonic categories that I would categorically reject. I think that those are not Semitic concepts, and they're only concepts if you care about Platonistic categories of being. I don't think they're necessary.
Okay, but still, I mean, even if we take those as Platonic conceptions, they're still conceptions, right? And so, I'm just trying to, again, just
God would be
God.
eternally existing from everlasting to everlasting is how the Bible describes it.
Yes.
That doesn't mean eternally simple or any of those categories. It just means he's always existed.
That is necessary. Yeah, well, that means he's a necessary being, right? That has a deity.
Not necessarily.
Has existence in and of himself.
So
how would you?
So let's theoretically, I don't think suicide would be rejected necessarily by Jewish categories. Like God, if he wanted to, and they would teach that God would never want to commit suicide or anything like that. I don't think that they would say God could not, if he wanted to, blink himself out of existence. I don't think that's Jewish thought. I think those are Platonic categories where God is this being, and this being has to have this property of necessary existence. And God, even if he wanted to, even if he's got all power, right? He could do anything. He can't commit suicide. I would say that categorically, that's a Platonistic category, and it's not necessarily necessary in Semitic religion.
Yeah, I guess and that goes into omnipotence and doing all things logically possible. And is it logically possible for a necessary being to kill himself? No. So God can't necessarily kill himself. And really, we're getting into the secret things. I'm really just trying to just make sure that we are still affirming. You talk about Jewish categories. The Jews certainly believed, even that passage that you quoted about that they worship demons. It says that they worship so-called gods who are no gods. He explicitly says these are no gods. They are nothing. What they're worshiping are demons. So he's using, and Elohim is translated into the Greek as theos, and that's theos right there. So, and Paul's familiar with the LXX, and he's familiar with the translation of Elohim as God, which is theos, which is applied to the one true God in the New Testament. And there he says these are no theos. neither
Right,
no Elohim. So
but they are demons, right? So they're not
certainly,
nothing. He was being a little bit. He's trying to communicate to us that they don't have ultimate power. They're not going to ultimately win out against God. They're wasting their time by sacrificing to these lesser beings, right?
yeah, okay, yeah, exactly. And so I'm just trying to, and you do affirm monotheism, that
Yeah,
there is only one supreme being that's always existed, and he created everything else.
right.
Is
Yeah,
is that you're just using divine to really be synonymous with spiritual? Is
yeah.
that
You could say
one
that. Like, who does
God?
Jacob wrestle with? The text variably describes Jacob's wrestling partner as an angel and also Yahweh. And it makes sense if
Yeah,
Yahweh is part of the category of angel.
definitely. I would most Orthodox would take that as the angel of the Lord is the Christophany, and so here angel at its root meaning just means messenger. So certainly,
Right. So,
and
but a
that
Christophany is God, right?
yeah, certainly. But I'm saying that he's the angel of the Lord, as in he's the messenger of the Lord, who himself is God, which is just like the second person of the Trinity is the Son of God, who himself also is God. But anyways, I just caught me off guard there a little bit, and I'm just trying
Yeah.
to make sure that we at least had the common ground of monotheism, and this is kind of my critique of Michael Heiser, which you quoted is. Even the New Testament, I don't have those passages off the top of my head, but it talks about the divine nature or the divine being, and it describes that as referring to God. And so when Heiser or when you basically use the word divine to be actually synonymous with spiritual, I just think that for most people this isn't overly helpful. We all understand that there are spiritual beings, but we use divine to be referring to the divine nature, which even the New Testament describes the divine nature is God. So we're using divine in continuity, not with some external reality, but even the New Testament as a synonym or description of God alone. And that's why when we say many divine beings or God is part of a class, he's part of a class as in he's part of a spiritual, he's a spiritual being related to other spiritual beings, but we want to always keep that creator creature distinction,
Yeah, I can
which
see what
I'm,
you're saying there. Yeah.
yeah. Um, but no, I want to get back to your question about the Tower of Babel, Genesis, and all of that. You're right that this is historical narrative, but I would say it's not true that in historical narrative we can't have figures of speech and non literal language infused into multiple genres. Just like it's not true that if you have a parabolic genre or a poetic genre that you can't have literal things. Like I can have a poem that says, I ran across the street and jumped
Yeah.
up and down. Well, that doesn't mean the jumping is not literal because this is a poetic structure there. So I wouldn't say that just because the overall text is historical means that there is no non-literal language being applied. That's the
That
first thing. The second thing, go
Oh,
ahead.
I said, yeah, that is true. And so, what you have to do with those situations, if you have to look for if it's an idiom, a figure of speech, what kind of meaning is it giving the audience? And number two, is it part of the narrative structure? Does the narrative make sense without that linchpin? If you pull that out, is it a major plot point in the narrative that the narrative cannot function without? So I'd say that would be kind of our test to try to figure out if speech is idiomatic or if it's to be taken literally.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I would just say some of these things, I do believe that God actually physically, and well, let me say something about this though. I do want one point of clarity. When you would agree with Jesus when he said that God is spirit, right? Or God is a spirit.
Yeah.
Would you, he's fundamentally a spirit, but he can take on a physical body. So he can show up in different forms and presumably cast off the forms when he's done with them. But God himself is a spirit, just like
Well,
angels do the same thing.
well, yeah. Paul talks about us getting spiritual bodies. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters in Genesis, so what, 2? So spirits don't necessarily not have form. That would be a Platonic category mistake, I would say. So we need to kind of figure out what type of spirit God is.
Yeah, certainly. Okay. Yeah, no problem. I was just really trying to establish the point that when the scriptures describe God with a physical body, that this is anthropomorphic language, and that we shouldn't actually conclude
Not
that.
always. In
Not always,
Genesis 18, he
not,
eats, right?
absolutely not always, right? The incarnation would be a supreme example of this.
Yeah.
So certainly God can show. I'm not denying. I don't think anyone denies that God can show up in a physical body. But
Some people
sometimes
do.
well, I hope, yeah. But sometimes the language that describing God doesn't seem to be describing God when he shows up on the earth with a physical body, but be describing God as he sits in heaven with nostrils, with nose, with eyelids, and all of these things. And this is clearly figurative language, and we're not supposed to believe that there are spiritual eyelids. That doesn't seem to be the intent. Would you say that we are supposed to conclude that there are spiritual nostrils and noses and
Well, the Daniel incident seems to be more of a vision, but the Isaiah incident seems to be like a physical transportation into the spiritual realm. And so we'd have to take those narratives and evaluate them one at a time to figure out what's going on there, what's the author trying to get at for the situation. And certainly God can hold court. We see God holding court in not only in Job but also in 1 Kings 22 and the Ahab incident. There sometimes are these divine counsels going on. You would agree with that, right?
Yeah, I don't have any problem with divine counsels. I don't have any problem with the fact that the Bible consistently communicates heaven in a human language so that we can understand a court and God having court and I honestly I have no idea of what it's going to look like when I get there. But I'm just saying that these descriptions that we find in the Bible seem to be more about helping me to understand what's going on than I'm actually supposed to be like, okay, there's the literal throne and there's the literal nostril and eyelid and here's the literal robe or all of those things. I wouldn't say that we're supposed to press those details. And that's not the point of the passage is to say, oh, look, there are sandals in heaven. I just don't think that that's the point of Isaiah. The point of Isaiah is that God is high and lifted up and he is a king and he's a kingly figure, which we can understand by understanding kingship.
Yeah, I could hear it. So what is your take on eschatology? Are we going to get a renewed earth? Are we going to live on the renewed earth with God as it writes in Revelation 21?
Yeah, I would affirm that. I would affirm that. I would affirm. Real quick, I want to answer that old question that you said a while ago about this language of the Tower of Babel, real quick, and then we can go into
Oh
eschatology.
yeah, that's fine.
No problem. The thing is, again, I would affirm that sometimes Genesis 6 is a different. Genesis 6 is a metaphoric language, and we can talk about that if you want. But Genesis 11, I think that very likely God did actually show up into doing this. But again, I think that that's showing us that God is not afraid to relate to us in human-like ways so that we can understand. So I especially with the Sodom and Gomorrah incident, I'm certain that God actually did physically show up and look around and walk around and that kind of thing. But that really is just showing us that God is, and really we see this from Genesis 1 in Genesis 2, where God creates the world in 7 days. He doesn't need to do that. And Augustine wrestled like, this is crazy. God could have created everything instantaneously. And he was wrestling with that issue. And we don't have to speculate of why Moses created that structure. He tells us in Exodus that just as God worked 6 days, so you're to work 6 days, and just as God rests, you are to rest. So I'm seeing Christological ramifications of all this from the very beginning, that God's saying, I'm going to act in such a way that you can imitate me, you can relate to me, you can understand me, that ultimately is perfectly manifested in the incarnation.
So can I direct you? This is my number one proof text in open theism is Exodus 32. And so we've been focusing so far on the conversation about present knowledge, divine nescience, that there might be present truths that God might not know. But Exodus 32, I think, is more of a indication that God doesn't know the future. God could have legitimate changes of mind. God responds to prayer, and God has emotional reactions sometimes to events that happen on earth. I don't know what your take is on divine emotions. Traditional Calvinism has impassibility as a value. I don't know if you affirm that.
I mean, there's different understandings of impassibility. I would say that God certainly has he has emotions of love and mercy and wrath and all of those things. They're not exactly like human emotions, and they're certainly not sinful in any way or out of control. But I have no problem saying that God communicates to us that He loves, and at least in there's an analogy to God's love and our love, such as that He applies this to Himself.
Hmm. Yeah, I could respect that. Exodus 32:7, the Lord says to Moses, "Go down, for your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves." The narrative element is God saying, "These are your people, Moses." And this is going to be reversed later on in the narrative, where Moses brings it back to God and says, "This is actually your people." This is the God still speaking. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it, sacrificed to it, and said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who you brought out of the land of Egypt." And the Lord says to Moses, "I have seen this people, behold, a stiff-necked. Therefore, let me alone in my wrath, that I may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make of you a great nation." And so, was God being serious when He said this? Was this a legitimate plan of God's?
I would say that God was legitimately angry, and that God was yeah I was communicate this is communicating God's extreme wrath, and that is likened to Him about to absolutely exterminate these people, and then he's saying that He's going to make a great nation of Moses, and that's a hypothetical, but it's a contrary to reality, and this is not actually God's plan. And the main point of this, again, is the main. This is really showing. This is incredible that this is in the Old Testament, because this is really showing how much God is willing to lower Himself. And so we really shouldn't be surprised that God was also willing to humble Himself and take on the form of a bondservant if He's willing to communicate Himself like this, where this language literally is not applicable to God, but He's willing to. I don't want to say play the part, but willing to communicate in such a way as if He is this out of control, angry deity who's about to just strike out on the people. And then here's Moses. I mean, look at this. Here's Moses employing God, saying, "Calm down, God. Don't do this. Have mercy." And then God's like, "Oh, you're right, Moses. I should have mercy." To me, taken literally, this draws serious questions about the character of God, and the fact that God is seemingly untrustworthy, temper tantrum. You know that he's over here said he's made these promises to Abraham. He's made these promises to Judah, saying that there will be a scepter from Judah. Is he a liar? I mean, he said that out of Judah was going to come the ruler. But if he kills everyone, Moses isn't from the tribe of Judah. So now all of a sudden he has to go back on his promises. And now, in Hebrews, it says that God cannot lie. And he swore an oath. And so now all of a sudden, well, we don't know if that's true, because here God wanted to lie, but thank God that Moses was more patient than God. See, I think you come to all kinds of problems in this text if you think that the main point of the text is to say that God is emotional and irrational and needs to be calmed down by humans. But rather, I think that the reason why God is accommodating Himself in such a way is to show that there's this appointed prophet. There's this appointed person, Moses, who is a man who God sets a scene up so that He will allow this man to intercede on the behalf of wicked people where God's wrath wants to come down on them, right? And that He will allow a human being to stand in the way, to be a mediator and relieve His wrath and send His wrath somewhere else. And that's wonderfully pictured in Jesus Christ, where it says that we have one God and one mediator between a man and God, the man Jesus Christ. This is ultimately pointing to the man Jesus, who is going to do that very thing and going to stand in the way between God's wrath and us, and He's going to alleviate that wrath so that we can have forgiveness. So I see a beautiful picture of Christ and the mercy of God, and God willing to condescend down to this level to communicate this beautiful truth. But we shouldn't take this literally to make God all of those negative things I just said.
Well, did Moses, did he believe that God had this wrath and that God was actually going to do this, kill the people?
I would say more or less, yeah. I would say that, I mean, Moses is living this out, and God is saying that He wants to destroy them, and Moses in his heart is like, no, Lord, don't do this. Don't burn your wrath against these people. don't dishonor your name in this way. So yes, Moses is responding to God, but I'm saying that this is all recorded, and God knows that Moses is going to do this. It's not like and I wonder what you would say. Will we actually say that God is like, oh man, Moses got in my way? Like, why did I have that conversation with Moses? If only, or God was like, I don't know why I was so mad. I'm so glad Moses did it, calm me down.
It definitely could be an invitation, like in the Sodom and Gomorrah incident, where he said, "Let's go talk to Abraham," because I know he's going to be a great nation, and to see what his input is on Sodom and Gomorrah. It definitely could be something like that. Well, why would he say, "Go away, let me burn my wrath"? Maybe he's inviting a response. That is a textual possibility. Moses, to me, doesn't seem like he's a Calvinist. He seems to me like he's open theist. He thinks that God has told him his plans, and Moses can change God's plans through intercession. And so it reads to me that Moses' direct response to God, it's not, oh, God, you know the future, and so tell me how this plays out. Your wisdom trumps all. My input's nothing compared to your omniscience of all events. Instead, he seems to break out into a multi-tiered argument why God should not destroy his people. He thinks that he can reason with God. He thinks that he could give arguments that God is going to respond to. That seems to be Moses's default response. He seems to be responding in such a way where he's having a rational dialogue with God in order to convince God to do something.
Yeah, I have no problem. And again, I would say, this is where I began with saying, I don't think just because we think that we can have conversations with God and that we can make rational arguments with God and think that he will respond to us, that leads us to open theism. I mean, we are human beings who are tensed beings who live in the present, and the past is gone and the future is potential. And God communicates us in such a way that he says, I will respond to your prayers, and I respond to the things that you do. So I don't really any tension with the fact that God hears us and responds to us and enters into a relationship with us, and at the same time that God is beyond space and time and in some unfathomable way that we have no access to. All we know is that God is beyond space and time, but he's also in time, dealing with us in time, and invites us to partake and participate in the things that he's accomplishing now. And so exactly how all this works, I don't know, but I am certain that the things that we do actually. So I'm what I'm saying is I think that nobody and no one should live in a fatalistic perspective. And I always give the analogy of one day soon we're probably going to watch this video. At least I'm going to watch this video.
Yeah.
Right. And when I watch this video, that everything to be fixed and I can't change it. But that doesn't mean now I know everything is active and I'm free and I'm moving next. And so what I'm saying is something can be both fixed and free. And so that's how the future, in my mind, is that God sees the future and understands the future, kind of like we look at video recordings of the past. He sees them free, but they're still fixed. And so it's the same way as I don't see that God's knowledge of the future is necessarily causative. That just because God knows the future doesn't mean that that our free decisions don't affect the future, and especially realizing that God is a character in the future. Like God isn't just merely timeless. God's also a character in the future or in the present that's making the future. So I'm just saying that I think that.
No, I'm glad. I'm glad you're explaining this in detail. I'm going to real quick run through Moses's arguments, and then we'll go to verse 14, and then I'll ask you if Moses actually convinced God, if Moses was the reason God changed his mind. The first argument is that Israel is God's people. The second argument in verse 12 is the Egyptians, if God were to just kill all of Israel, then the Egyptians would say, hey, this is a death cult God. He just brought all his people in the wilderness and killed them all. This is a bad God. And so it's a PR argument. You will have bad public perception if you go through with this, God. And then last of all, he points to the promises, as you did earlier, and you're talking about what would happen if this goes through. Moses points to the same thing you did, that would invalidate some previous promises. And then verse 14 sums this up. It's basically, and the Lord relented, which is, a nostril flare. It's typically used of changing your mind in the Bible. Relented of the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. So God said he would do something, and then he didn't do it. And so the question is, did Moses convince God, and did which argument, if any, convinced God?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in one sense, Moses did convince God, i.e., that God is willing to play the part of an angry sovereign who's been wronged and has real anger, who's about to destroy his people, and he allows Moses to play the part as a cooling mediator who gives reasons and convinces him to relent his wrath. And so, this really did happen. God was really mad. And Moses really did get arguments that really did cause God to relent of the anger that he really did speak against the people. So this all happened, literally. And from a human perspective, this is how everything played down here on the earth. Just like Jacob wrestled with the angel of the Lord. It wasn't fake wrestling. You talk to Jacob, he didn't say, no, he was exhausted. His hip was broken, right? He was actually wrestling. And even sometimes I wrestle with my kids. I'm not fake wrestling. I'm actually wrestling with my kids. But I'm not using all my power. I mean, we really going to believe that God, as you couldn't have annihilated Jacob? Of course he could have. And same thing here. That God, it's not as if, again, this calls into serious question the intelligence of God and the character of God, and this is to be taken literally. To me, God is playing the role. He's functioning as the role to teach us a greater spiritual lesson. So from a greater perspective, right? God was not it was
you broke up there real quick. So repeat that again, from a greater perspective, saying, and then you broke up.
Yeah, greater perspective that this is not God changing his mind, but this is God, in fact, just like inviting Satan to give an answer, or just like you said with Adam, inviting Adam. Where are you, Adam? Did you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? It's not as if God doesn't know these things, but he's inviting Adam to say, yes, I did, and to repent. And Adam fails to test again by not repenting. Well, here, same thing. God, if God really wanted to be alone, he could have just packed his bags up and left. And the fire coming down from heaven. But he's staying there and waiting and patiently listening to Moses' arguments and relents. And like I said, I think the main point of this is shocking text for a Jew is to say, wow, God's mediator can really relieve his wrath. Like God really listens to his mediator, and these mediators can really function as our savior, and he's a human. That's amazing because God, of course, came down as a human. So from one sense, yes, God changed his mind. Ultimately, though, God knew this was going to happen, and he wanted this conversation to happen.
So that's reading it kind of like this is play acting. Like, I'm going to put up this situation just so that Moses fills this role, which can give some maybe inspiration to people. And did the arguments really convince God? Did Moses's arguments change God's mind? I think the face value reading the text is yes. And I think this this narrative that you want to impose on it, where God is play acting, and God knew all along on these arguments. God had these arguments at the forefront of his mind. He always had eternal plans that never were subverted, never changed. And it was just for our sake. I don't think that bears out in the text. I don't think this text indicates it. And the interesting thing about this text is that there are future commentators in the Bible who talk about this text, and they don't seem to take your position. They seem to take my position. And so in
I would love to look at those texts. But real quick, and I would love to look at those texts. I wasn't quite saying play acting. I'm saying that God is enacting this as a living parable to communicate some truth. And just to give you one example, it talks about, I think it was Enoch. It says that he walked with the Lord 365 years. 365 years is the same amount of days. To me, we have a poetic God. Same thing with Genesis. He's not play acting by creating in 6 days and resting on one. But God is doing this so that it can be imitated. And so the parables and Jesus' parables are full of doing and act. He curses a fig tree. Is he play acting by cursing the fig tree? In one sense, he's mad that he didn't get his fruit, but in another sense, he's giving a living parable. So I wouldn't do so pejorative to say that God is simply play acting. I would say that God is giving this wonderful picture and parable to communicate truth to us. But please.
Yeah.
it's a
So Moses wrote Exodus. It seems like Moses legitimately believed that God was angry and God had strong emotions. And in Deuteronomy 9:19, he recounts this incident. And this is what he writes. He says, "For I was afraid of the anger and hot displeasure that the Lord bore against you, so that he was also ready to destroy you. But the Lord listened to me that time also." So this is a reoccurring event where Moses describes God listened to him. God listened to him. And God was ready to do something. God was going to do something, but God listened to him. So furthermore, we could switch the psalmist in Psalms. We could go to Psalms 106:23, and it recounts this incident. It's looking back on this incident, and it says there, "Therefore he said he would destroy them, had not Moses, his chosen one, stood in the breach before him to turn away his wrath from destroying him." So this verse as well reads to me as if God's wrath is being turned away. God is repenting of something that he legitimately was going to do. Moses changed God's mind, is how this is
yeah,
reading to me.
yeah. I mean, I don't see these passages any different than the one we saw in Exodus. I mean, again, I'm agreeing with you that this was a historical event that actually happened in this conversation. God's wrath was real, and Moses entered against us is real. Is real, and Christ really does alleviate God's wrath. I'm not saying that any of this is not real, but the only thing that I'm saying is that that God is really shockingly bringing himself down to be able to communicate this scene so that we can have it acted. But I'm just arguing that um, I do not believe that God had forgot these arguments. I mean, again, this to me is more than just open theism about God not knowing the future. This really calls into question God's character. Uh, that God is literally throwing a fit here. I mean, he's literally throwing a fit where a puny human with their puny human mind remembers more of God's promises and more of God's reputation than God himself. I mean, I really wonder if this isn't not only challenging God's knowledge, but God's character, God's holiness, God's goodness, that he would literally throw a tantrum fit where a human being has to cool him down and get him to not be a liar.
Yeah,
And
when I'm angry, I might make rash decisions as well. And I think the text bears that out, that this is God is angry, and Moses does calm him down, and he calms him down through rational action. The last verse I'd like to turn to that recounts this incident is, remember, Moses gave 3 different arguments. He said, these are your people. These are the promises that you gave to them that are going to be violated. And then last of all, if you kill them, your public perception is going to be down the toilet. Everyone will think you're a death cult god. And so in Ezekiel 20:13, it says, "But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes, but rejected my rules, by which, if a person does them, he shall live, and my Sabbaths they greatly profaned. And then I said I would pour out my wrath upon them in the wilderness to make a full end of them." God's recounting, I said I would kill them. "But I acted for my name's sake, that should not be profaned in the sight of the nations, in whose sight I had brought them out." So he's saying the reason that he didn't destroy them was this argument that Moses gave, that he would look like a death cult god. He's giving the reason why he changed his mind, why he didn't do what he said he would do according to the text. The reason is explicit. So it appears to me that Ezekiel is looking back on this instance and saying Moses' arguments legitimately worked. These arguments had an effect on God. Moses changed God's mind, and it was for a PR reason.
yeah, I mean, again, I would agree with you in the sense that these arguments were valid. Moses' arguments were valid, and we don't just see this in this Moses incident. We see this all throughout the Psalms, that people are praying to God and using one of this argument constantly shows up about the sake of your name and for your glory. And so I think that invites us as Christians to say the same thing,
So
that
God's
that God be
changing.
glorified.
God's not doing what he said he would do for his name's sake. So was God lying when he said he was going to do it? How does not doing it for his name's sake calculate into him saying it, and him further on in all these other scriptures saying that this was his legitimate plan that he was going to do? And then this argument's coming to bear as the reason, the cause of why God doesn't go through with it. So did this information affect God?
What I'm saying is that this reason, and not just this reason. I wouldn't say that this text suggests that this is the only reason that God didn't care about being a liar and fulfilling His promises or any of those. No, I think those other reasons are valid as well. But what I'm trying to say is that those reasons were always valid. God did not forget about those reasons, and God didn't have to be reminded of those reasons. And so again, we can think about this situation. You said you have 6 kids, right?
Yeah.
You have 6 kids, and I'm sure that you could get into a situation where you start saying things to your kids like, we're not going to go to Disneyland because you didn't clean your room. We're not going to go. And then you allow your kids to wrestle and to work through to teach either your other kids something or teach them something. And you're smart enough to know how the conversation were to go. And so after your kid makes all the right responses and brings out all the good reasons, Dad, you promised that you said that you would do it. You're a man of your word. You tell us to be a people of our word. How about you be a man of your word? And throughout this conversation, eventually you come around into ultimately taking the kids what you said that you were going to do. But imagine that you actually were planning that the whole time, and we're really just trying to use this as a teaching lesson, as a way to communicate something, something to the audience, something to your kids. So I don't see, if we can do that as teachers, and that can be a powerful teaching lesson, then I don't see why God can't do that either. That God cannot.
In those situations, I wouldn't say that the kids changed my mind necessarily. Maybe that's a legitimate reason, but I wouldn't say that their arguments convinced me. Oh, your arguments convinced me. Arguments that not only I knew beforehand, that I also already had considered, and I already knew that I was going to bring them to Disneyland regardless. So I'm lying to them. I say I'm not going to do something that I fully know that I'm going to do. And then I say that the reason that I'm not going to do what I said I was going to do was for this reason that only affects me, my name, my PR. All the other parents will think I'm bad if I don't bring my kids to Disneyland. I say, well, that's a good, legitimate reason. That's the reason I changed my mind. That wouldn't be my reason. My reason would be like, I knew you were going to do this. I knew these were going to be your responses, and congratulations, you fulfilled the test. You've passed the test, and then we're going to go. I wouldn't attribute my repentance, my quasi-repentance, to their reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. I mean, but what I would say is, once again, I mean, we don't know what it's like to be a timeless being outside of reality who knows all factors. We have no idea what that's like. And so what God does is he communicates to us as a being who is like us, so that we can have this back and forth relationship. God is willing to communicate for us to treat God in that way. What I'm saying is, I don't think that that's ultimately true about his being. And as far as these arguments, the fact that your kids were able to figure out the right argument doesn't mean that you weren't convinced by the argument. No, you were always able to trace your thinking and to get to the right arguments. So it's not as if that your kids' arguments didn't convince you. No, your kids' arguments did convince you the entire time. You just wanted your kids to think through the situation and give them the experience of bringing these arguments to you and reasoning with you. I would also say there's hypotheticals that are contrary to reality, and so there's a sense that it's hypothetical, but it is contrary to reality that God was going to destroy them. But ultimately, since he knows Moses and he knows that he's going to intercede and he's setting this whole scene up, it is a hypothetical, but it's contrary to reality.
So the thing about that is we looked at 4 different texts about the same incident. We looked at the primary text and 3 various commentaries recounting this, and they all seem like they're written by open theists. All of them seem like they are writing about the literal events that happened in the way that the face value original text reads, and none of them seem to suggest the timelessness that you suggest, the total omniscience of all the future, changelessness, immutability. They all seem to suggest that the face value reading is the accurate and literal reading of it. It's not just a hypothetical event.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, brother, that I look at these, I don't really see them so much as commentaries. I mean, I really see them pretty much just restating as fact the Exodus account. I don't really see much of a interaction with them or much of an explanation. They're just recounting the history of the Exodus account. So I don't really see these counting as a commentary. And I think the most important thing is the original audience was not confused of whether or not they were open theists or not. It's not, I mean, that's what we're doing, right? We aren't the original audience. So we have to go and reconstruct and rediscover what the Hebraic thought and what the Greek thought is and how we synthesize all of this data to figure out the underlying theology of the original audience. But it's not as if the original audience is confused until they're reading this book and trying to figure out, okay, is God open theist or does God know all contingent reality? They already have that theology and they're already reading these texts in alignment with that pre-theology. So that's what I'm saying is we have to do the hard work of synthesizing the Bible as a whole to figure out what that underlying theology is, and so then we can read the text as the original audience would have already read the text.
I think the overwhelming majority of the Bible says the exact opposite of that Israel was continually switching over to other religions, the Baals and the Marduks. And there was a fight from the Israelite prophets to say, God is a God who sees. You think you're doing these things in secret? God sees. They have to argue current omniscience of events against an audience who's hostile to that conception. In Ezekiel, God, he brings Ezekiel to this door in the mound, or there's a mound, there's a hill, and there's like a magical door that God opens up. He brings them in there, and in there they're worshiping all sorts of strange beasts and idols. And he says basically they think that I can't see this. I can see this. The people in Israel, they were not Calvinists. They didn't believe in total omniscience of all future events. They denied that God knew present reality, present things. They would say God doesn't see. There's going to be no ramifications for my actions. And that was pretty standard theology. And the response to this is not total omniscience of all future events. God has all past, present, current knowledge of all things that were ever going to happen. This is ungenerated knowledge that is part of his essential character. That's not the argument. Instead, the counter argument is God does see what you're going to do, what you do. And you're going to have to account for that. At some point in the future, you're going to have to account for the things you did because God does know and God does see.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a couple of things you said about certainly there are people in, and this is, I think, a point of clarity. When I'm not saying that everyone in Israel had the right theology. No, certainly not. That there were many people in the Israelite original audience that didn't have the right theology and that the prophets were correcting that theology. But that's when it's important to distinguish the remnant who did have the proper theology and those who did believe in monotheism, did believe that God knows the future, God is a rewarder of the future, and all of the general population that didn't have those beliefs and were affected by all of the pagan beliefs and all that. So I would just want to distinguish that this is something that Heiser does as well, is he goes into the Old Testament and shows that they were henotheistic. A lot of the unbelieving Jews were henotheistic, essentially polytheistic in that respect, and then conclude, okay, that's the theology of the writers of the New Testament or the Old Testament. I'm saying, well, whoa. I mean, that's quite a jump. The fact is, the writers of the Old Testament are fighting against this and saying, no, these people they're not gods. Have no other gods before me. They're opposing this false theology. That would be the same mistake as if a believer is going against the Judaizers, that the Judaizers were the original disciples. No, the original disciples were not the Judaizers, were fighting against the Judaizers. So I would just bring that out. And then the last thing is, I would say that in Isaiah especially, the prophets do in fact point to God knowing all things and God knowing the future to correct some of the false theology and distinguish God from all of the false deities. So I would say it isn't true that it's completely absent from the Bible, this conception of God being all knowing, God knowing the past, God knowing the present and the future.
So yeah, I think we agree there that there's a significant large portion of Israel who does not believe God has even current knowledge. And I pulled up an article I wrote quite some time ago, just with a couple of verses that I'm not saying you disagree with me here, we agree together, that the fool says in his heart, God has forgotten, he hides his face, he will never see. This is pretty common. They encourage themselves in an evil manner. They talk of laying snares secretly, saying, "Who will see them?" But the point isn't necessarily that all of Israel denied current omniscience, or even the version of omniscience you ascribe to. Uh, the critical element is, how do the prophets respond to this? And if you would like to turn to Isaiah, that's actually a pretty interesting context, because it seems to me in Isaiah that it's not an argument for omniscience, it's an argument for ability to accomplish. That these false idols, they can't do. God says something, and then God does something. God can do things. Seems to be the argument against the Calvinist notion that God controls all things. That wasn't an Israelite notion that he's arguing against in Israelite theology. God can do things. Seems to be his argument.
I certainly think that the text is saying that God can do things, and God knows things. But I think it goes beyond that. And he's one of the things that he is saying, that what distinguishes Yahweh from these false gods is that Yahweh knows the future, and that Yahweh is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. And not only does he know the future, but he knows the past, and he knows why things happen. And so this distinguishes God from all the false gods. Of being a prophet is to be something that you say or something that you do to be verified. And this is because God knows the future. And so if God knows the future and you're his prophet, then he can tell you something of the future, and then you can verify, oh, this person really is in connection with God. So I would say that that Isaiah does bring out and does communicate that God does know the future, and this distinguishes and proves that he is a true God versus all the false deities.
So we started this conversation talking about, how does God know something? Is this knowledge inherent in God? God is perfectly simple, that his knowledge is identical, eternal with himself? Or is there a mechanism? Does God know because God sees? God sits in heaven and watches the ways of man. I think Isaiah gives us the mechanism that God has declared and God will do. God knows because God does. There's a mechanism there, and it's not the mechanism of omniscience that you ascribe to. There's a reason God knows, and that reason is explicit in the text.
Point to?
I'm sorry? Are you frozen?
No, I can see you. I just don't. There's several texts here. Which particular text in Isaiah 40 are you?
Well, it's throughout here. Basically, God says and then God does. Let's see.
Okay.
God, who sits in the circle of heaven,
it,
he brings princes to nothing. These are action verbs, right? He's plants, he sows.
Yeah. I don't have any problem with God knowing the future, because he declares and decrees and brings to pass. He foreordains the future. I would say that I don't think that necessarily suggests that that's how all of the future comes about, but maybe that is the mechanism of God knowing all the future, because he simply ordains it and writes it out and writes a script. I think it's also possible that God just simply knows the future, but I would distinguish this from there's multiple different types of knowledge. There's knowledge of just propositional knowledge that you just know intrinsically, just being with knowledge, and then there's knowledge of volitional knowledge, of knowledge of things that you're going to do. So you certainly know, and even in this conversation, you're probably already thinking about things that you're going to say. Well, you have knowledge of what you're about to volitionally do. You can think, after this, I'm going to go eat, I'm going to go sleep, right? You have knowledge of your volitional actions. One way that God knows the future is simply he knows do. But that he just knows these realities that, and there's several examples of God knowing this, but I think the clearest example, and I'll be interested in your commentary, is the example of Peter's denial. That here Jesus is able to predict not just that Peter is going to deny, but that Peter is going to deny him 3 times. What specificity there, and it's going to happen before these specific parameters, namely a cock crowing. And then when he does it, it immediately happens that a cock crows. Talk about a few seconds off, right? And you have the cock crowing twice, and he's only denied him twice, and now Jesus is a false prophet. And we compare this with James, that says that God tempts no one with evil. So if God tempts no one with evil, then God is not volitionally making Peter deny him. Does God know that Peter is going to deny? these propositional knowledge of the future.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
so yeah, real quick, one piece of clarity before we go there. Was Jonah a false prophet? Jonah, he said 40 days and Nineveh is going to be overthrown.
No, certainly not. 40.
So
Go
so
ahead.
it's not conclusive that if Jesus was wrong about this, then he would be a false prophet. Because in the Jonah incidents, and you'd probably say this was conditional, right?
Yeah.
And there are good reasons why it didn't come about. And so if it didn't happen, if Peter didn't deny 3 times before the cock crowed, you'd likely, if that's what the Bible recorded, say that also was conditional, wouldn't you?
I would. I'm not sure. I mean, this is that counterfactual, right? Hypothetical, contrary to reality. I would have serious problems if Peter, Jesus said you're going to deny me 3 times, and that you all are going to betray me, and in fact, Peter dies defending Christ, or he's the 4th guy on the cross, and he's crucified right there with Jesus. I mean,
But
I'm not
in
going to. That
the
would cause me some serious problems.
in the Nineveh example, it was a warning, right? So they were warned, and then they acted accordingly, and the prophecy, quote unquote, failed. Conditional prophecy. So if Jesus warned him that this is going to happen, and he, quote unquote, reacts to it and then doesn't do it, we wouldn't call Jesus a false prophet necessarily. I'm just saying that it's not necessary that if this prophecy failed, that Jesus is a false prophet.
It's interesting. I mean, I need to chew on that and wrestle with that. I've never even thought through that. That's interesting. But I will say, back to the Jonah incident, that when God declared that Jonah was going to be destroyed, that whole incident screams that Jonah is sending the prophet to give the people the opportunity to repent, and they recognize that this was the whole reason why God didn't just send the fireballs from heaven and strike them down, and went through the effort of sending Jonah to communicate this, was to give them a chance to repent. Jonah knows that, and then so when God extends the repentance, Jonah's not like, what's going on? You're a big liar, God. He didn't say that. He says, I knew you were going to do that.
I knew you were going to do this.
And this is, in fact, why I didn't want to come. So Jonah understands that the original audience who hears the message understands if they repent, they're going to be forgiven. So I don't see in any way.
You could take all those arguments and just apply it to a failed Jesus prophecy. All those arguments work. It was given specifically to him, and so that he has a chance to react and respond. It was a warning. And this is a known attribute of God, that God repents when people repent, Jeremiah 18. So all of the same arguments you just made work for Jesus as well. So it's not necessary that Jesus is a false prophet if the prophecy fails. So how does Jesus know this is going to happen? So Jesus was not omniscient, right? He didn't know the day and hour of his return. And so assumably he's getting this knowledge from God the Father, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you need to be omniscient to know a future reality. I don't think that logically follows, right? I can know a future reality without being omniscient. So I don't know how Jesus knew, but I presume that it was either by the Holy Spirit, his divine nature, or the Father. So one of those.
So let's assume he's coordinating with God the Father this incident, and the purpose of the incident, I think, is very telling. I think you would agree with me that the overall purpose is to convict him on a personal level and to turn him into a warrior for God. Ultimately, that's the goal of this. So I'm
not sure. I mean, it's interesting.
To become the pillar of Christianity on this rock, I'll build the church. Right.
Well, certainly. I mean, certainly he did restore him, but I'm just not sure if we can say that. I think there's a multifaceted meaning here. One is to show that Jesus, in fact, knows the future. I don't think that this was left on God, that Christians would later use the scripture as a future, and also Jesus sharing in some kind of attribute of God in that way. But I think there's also a sense that, yeah, I mean, Peter, there's also a lived out parable that, what's Peter do when he hears this? He trusts in himself. He doesn't even pray. He falls asleep. So there's a whole lot here. I just wouldn't want to isolate this to one meaning. I think there's a whole multi-sermons that are packed in there, right?
It's multifaceted. So it seems to me Jesus had a very close relationship with Peter. they're using this incident, God and Jesus together are using this incident in order to affect some eventual outcome. And it's not just, it could be to as a future prophecy to foretell events. It seems very personal in nature. It doesn't seem like a declaration to the crowd so that the whole crowd, everyone sees this and then believes, oh, this happened just as you prophesied. It seems more like a personal conviction. So it seems that God knows that Peter's weak. He's not the man that he needs to be to set up the church. And so it looks like they orchestrate this scenario in order to convict him. They know his character, they know he's weak, and they use their knowledge of his character in order to predict how he's going to react to these very tense situations. If you're in this situation and there's a chance you're going to go up on the cross too, you might act similarly, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what the thing is, well, let me say, I do agree with you that he didn't say this in a public scene. This was a private conversation. But it was also a private conversation that was recorded, and Jesus knew that this conversation was going to be recorded. So there's multi-levels here. One sense, there was a private conversation. Another sense that God knew this, we were going to be talking about this. For example, one day down the line here, many Christians from that time would be talking about this. But I guess, I mean, this goes into questions about libertarian free will, which I'm more than willing to talk to you about how is it that God can predict human beings' decisions when their decisions are arbitrary. That God can know his character all he wants. That Peter could have equally denied Christ no times or one time or 3 times or 10 times. So I have no idea how God supposedly is able to know Peter so well that he knows what arbitrary choices Peter is going to make. That seems to be inherently.
But was it arbitrary? It seems. Let's say, for sake of argument, let's pretend Peter's weak, and he knows that he's going to deny him in order to save his own skin. Let's say he flags the memory of 3 different individuals before the rooster crows in order to get them to go confront him about that. It seems within the realm of possibility that he's orchestrating this situation to convict him on a personal level, so much so that it's if it just happened on its own, if Jesus didn't prophesy this and convict him personally, it's probably not as hard-hitting as if your leader, the person that you are swearing allegiance to, they say, I know you're going to fail me, and then you do fail. And then you are reminded of this incident, which you were told you were going to fail by the person that you had sworn all your allegiances to. It heightens the situation.
So if I understand what you're saying that God is the one who activated Peter's placing him in a situation and then grabbing people and messing with their free will and getting them accuse Peter so that it sounds like entrapment to me. It sounds like
entrapment.
Entrapment.
God does that sometimes. Nebuchadnezzar, there was a massive imposition on Nebuchadnezzar, turning him into a wild beast until Nebuchadnezzar repented and followed the Lord. God's not non-coercive. I could coerce people. I could tell my kids, you clean your room or I'm going to give you a spanking. God could do that too. That doesn't mean that my kids don't have free will anymore. It just means that when they're making rational choices, maybe they're going to have to suffer some sort of consequences for those choices. And maybe Nebuchadnezzar, in his rejection, has to suffer as a wild beast.
I don't have any problem with God bringing punishments and causing people to suffer, right? I believe that. What I have a problem with is how this kind of view where it predicts that Peter is going to deny him and then ensures that this is going to happen by grabbing people and causing them to be the temptation, so that Peter most certainly will fulfill this prophecy. It seems to be suggesting a character of God predicts 2 scriptures. James, which says that when you are tempted, don't let anyone think that he's being tempted by God, but you're being tempted by your own desires. Well, I don't know how this is applicable to Peter. Peter certainly was tempted by God according to the scheme, and he was entrapped by God. And then, of course, 1 Corinthians 10:13 that says that when you're tempted, don't let any know that no temptation has overtaken you that's not common to man. God is faithful; He will beyond your ability, but with the temptation, will also provide a way of escape. It sounds like God is certainly entrapping him and certainly not wanting him to escape. and so that he can fulfill his own prophecy. It just, can you see why I'm uncomfortable with this scheme?
I can see definitely why you're uncomfortable with it. So one thing about language is when we've come across these absolute statements like God cannot change. Well, there's statements in the Bible that man cannot change. Even the Tower of Babel incident that we looked at, God says about man that nothing man proposes will be withheld from him. And basically, if you want to take that language literally, God is claiming man's omnipotent, that he's omnipotent, that he could do anything. But the language is hyperbolic. And so when you come across things like God does not tempt people, does this mean back in Chronicles that when Satan in Chronicles, and then what is it, is Yahweh in Kings, and the same incident, it says that Yahweh tempted David to count the people, that Yahweh caused this. And so what's more probable, that James is forgetting this incident, or that James is using general rules of thumb or hyperbolic speech, that there are marked exceptions, but it's not the general rule?
I mean, yeah, I would say that I think with James, I don't think James has forgotten about this incident. I think that God is a sovereign Lord. Uh, for James to be saying that God never allows us to be tempted would be just nonsense. Of course, God allows us to be tempted. What James is denying is that God is actively causing people to be tempted, that God is the one who's enticing you, and God
But
is the one trying to draw you away into sin.
is that an
But he's
absolute
not,
rule or a rule of
he's,
thumb?
I would say there's an absolute rule that God is not the one who's drawing you away, but God can certainly, such as someone else, to tempt you. But his desire in that temptation is for you to overcome the temptation. And sometimes he allows you, he'll allow you to fall into it, but his desire isn't for you to fall and to be damned and be destroyed. That's the desire of the devil. We shouldn't confuse God with the devil. God's desire is for you to overcome evil, just like what he said to Cain, that sin lies at the door and seeks to destroy you, right? But you should rule over it. So he will allow Cain to be tempted. He will allow David to be tempted, but his ultimate desire is for him to them to overcome it.
Yeah.
So that
Not
I wouldn't use hyperbole there.
Not necessarily always. It seems pretty standard, even in Calvinist theology, that God really did want Pharaoh to resist in order to make his power known. That God would prefer that Pharaoh pushes back so that he could institute this series of miracles, series of plagues, in order that the entire world fears Yahweh. It talks about God hardening Pharaoh's heart.
That would take us quite a direction, but I take the view of that God's hardening is God allowing you as his own, and allowing more evil, or you to authentic yourself is to magnify God's glory. But the one that's the one to obey and to let the people go. And it's Moses. I mean, not Moses. It's Pharaoh, who his own wicked nature, which God withdraws for a sovereign purpose of destroying him. That's the relationship I would see there. So I would not see God as the active agent in there. But
so
that
seems to be counter to a standard Calvinist systematic theologies, where God kind of is the active agent in John Calvin. Not that I'm saying you can't hold that position or anything, or that you have to agree with John Calvin. It just seems, it's an interesting view to me. But it seems to me that for these what rules that people want to take as absolutes, there's possible counterexamples, and the absolutes might not necessarily be absolute.
I mean, I don't disagree with you on that per se, but the examples that you gave were examples of hyperbole, where it's obvious that hyperbole is being used. And like you said, if we study the genre, we study the literature, we look at the passage, we don't just arbitrarily say that the hyperbole is being here. We have to actually look at it. And so when I'm looking at James, I'm looking at 1 Corinthians 10:13, especially 1 Corinthians 10:13, for example, says God is faithful. I mean, how do we apply hyperbole there? I mean, well, God is sometimes faithful and sometimes he's unfaithful. It doesn't seem to make any sense to apply hyperbole in that context. So I don't disagree that hyperbole is possible. I just don't think that in these contexts, hyperbole is what's happening there.
Mm-hmm. So I think narrative is very telling, especially narrative which is supposed to be historical in nature, which describes things God does, things God says, and I think when this is pretty standard ancient Jewish theology, very systematic, where people who research the Old Testament, especially, say that Israelite theology, they don't generalize except for based on specific instances. They look at a large data set, a large set of narratives, and they make general claims about that large set of narratives, rather than the Greek method, where they sit down and they say, what would make God the best God? Oh, he can't change. He must have all knowledge. He must have all power. He must be outside of time, perfectly simple. That doesn't seem to be how Israel did their theology. Rather, in Isaiah, for example, God's power is illustrated, and it goes back to historical examples of what God has done. God's powerful because he led you out of Egypt. God's powerful because he could count the waters in his hand.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly you're going to find a friend in me and some of that. I'm no friend of it, and I'm certainly no friend of armchair. Just sit back and speculate. Well, okay, God's the greatest conceivable being. So, what's my definition of the greatest conceivable being? And all of a sudden, God has to conform to my random speculations. You're not going to find any friend in me in that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, though, I also, you're not going to find a friend in me thinking that the Old Testament or the New Testament came about by people in the desert who were Jewish thinking up who God was. No, I think that Peter makes it very clear that all no scripture came by man's own thinking up, but as they were moved by the Spirit, they were revealing these things. So I certainly think that God, who revealed himself, is the one who communicated some of these attributes. But again, I would agree that some of these attributes, if you actually try to support them from the Bible, are much more nuanced sometimes than what we just hear, such as God's omnipotence. If you find in the Bible, you won't find any statement God can do all things logically possible. I don't disagree with that statement, but you just won't find that statement.
Yeah.
Instead, you'll find God created everything out of nothing. God is stronger than all of his enemies. God beats up on the devil like a punching bag. You'll find statements like this. Now, I do think that you can extrapolate. Well, if God can create everything out of nothing, then what can God not do? And even it says that God can. There is a few statements that God can bring. He can call things that don't exist into existence. He can call the dead back to life. So there are a few statements that seem to suggest that. But bottom line is, I'm agreeing with you that if I'm going to say God is omnipotent, I want to back it up with Scripture. If I'm going to say God is omniscient, I'm not going to just speculate about what that means. I'm going to back it up with Scripture. Nevertheless, though, this is where we do disagree. Is I'm saying in Scripture that God is demonstrating that he knows the future, and then he says he knows the future. So I have both God saying it and then God demonstrating it in countless prophecies. I mean, the Bible is full of countless prophecies. And so that's why I'm concluding with most Christians that we don't need Greek philosophy to come to recognize that God knows the future.
And I agree with that God makes prophecies about the future. He knows the future in the way that I know the future. One example I use on my program sometimes is 6 months ago, I invested $200 into Predict It, and now my portfolio is at $400 because I accurately predicted not only Ted Cruz would win his Senate election in Texas, I predicted Trump would not be kicked out of office by now as well. I don't have to be omniscient to know things about the future. I don't have to know all details about all future events. And I would agree with you. God does know the future, but the question is, how does God know the future? Does he know it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm not sure. I'm making a knowledge claim when I'm saying that God knows the future. I'm not saying that God can simply sometimes predict the future, because just like I'm sure you are able to predict the future, you don't really know the future until it comes to pass. And I'm sure that you make wrong predictions, let me ask you this. Do you find in the biblical data God making faulty predictions about the future that don't your interpretation? Would you say that God, in fact, sometimes thinks things are going to happen that don't happen, and God's predictions are wrong?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So I'm saying that these aren't knowledge claims. Then knowing the future, this is God believing things about the future that may or may not be true. But I do want to ask you this.
In common vernacular, we would say it's knowing the future.
Well, I guess common vernacular, we might be able to say that, but I'm saying that's not quite precision of what it means to actually know the future is to have a hunch about the future. But again, I want to, while I have you here, about what you said about Peter, that God knew his character, right? He knew his person of who he was, so that he could make a prediction. And by the way, we do this all the time. We
Yeah.
see people's character and we make predictions, and they're extremely, I don't want to say extremely, but often they're pretty accurate, right? It's often not that we're not as complicated and arbitrary as people try to make us. We can often see, yeah, that guy's about to get in this car, and sure enough, he gets in his car, right? We can make these kind of predictions, even about moral things. But
Yeah.
this seems to work much better in my view of which would be source libertarian free will, or I also think that that's really no different than compatibilism. Then I don't know how this fits in what it sounds like your view of libertarian free will standing would be countercausal decision making, and the ability to be indifferent, that your decisions are, all things being equal, you can do A or not A. And there's no real, you might have reasons, but there's no of why you chose A or not A. Is that, well, how would you define your view of free will?
uh, the ability to do else. It's interesting. God does have failed expectations in the Bible, like in Isaiah, in the parable of the vineyard. He says, "I expected good grapes, but I didn't get them." So much so that in the parable, he built a wine press, and this parable is saying that this is what I expected, and then it didn't materialize. And you see that elsewhere in the Bible, where God expects something. I expected Judah to return, but she did not return, is what the language reads. And so it seems that God has failed expectations, admittedly, in the Bible by his own words. I think we should pay attention when God is actually talking, when the source quote is attributed to Yahweh, where Yahweh in Exodus 32 repents. If God is saying that he repents, especially in Ezekiel, of the Exodus 32 narrative, I think we should give privilege to that communication that God is giving us in his own words, in his own quote.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I think that we need to understand that how the original audience would have understood, and that's what I was saying, that we need to understand that, and since we don't have access to the original audience, what we do have access is the canon of Scripture, and so we systematize all of this. We need to systematize these scriptures with contingent statements like this. We need to systematize other scriptures that seem to suggest that God knows the future and determines it. And we put this all together and try to figure out, okay, they both can't be literally true, right? God can't literally know all the future and then be surprised. And so then we have to decide, okay, which language is metaphoric, and which language is to be taken literal. And so what I'm saying is that I would ultimately take this kind of language as metaphoric, and believe that it's again describing God in anthropomorphic ways, and just as basically it's supposed to be communicating that God is disappointed. The same thing with the language of repentance. When we repent, when we're sad and we relent, we feel great sorrow. I don't know if you ever repented on anything.
No,
But
never. No, I'm just joking. I'm
that
joking.
you do something and you feel terrible about it. You just feel absolutely sick in your stomach. And in fact, I would say that's probably the worst feeling that people gnaw at themselves. Like, if only I would have known, I wouldn't have done this. And it just eats at them. In fact, the other day, my son got injured, and I felt that if I just would have known, I could have got in there and prevented the injury. It was actually really terrible. Thank God.
No.
He
Oh
healed
no.
fine. He's fine. But I'm just saying that you can understand that kind of pain and sorrow and anguish. And I think that if we look at that language throughout the Bible, that's what we find, is that this is a description, just like God's right hand is God's metaphoric way of describing God's power. Then this relenting language is a metaphoric way of saying that God really, really is disturbed and hurt by Saul. He's really hurt by humanity's wickedness and evilness, and it is likened to a man relenting and repenting. So that's how I would understand that language. And especially, that's a great example, because the Bible says he repented. And then in the same context and in the same book, it says he does not repent. He's not like a man, and he doesn't repent. So we have A and not A. Well, like I know, contradiction is something cannot be a time and in the same way or in the same sense. So unless we're going to you hold that the Bible has no errors, I assume.
Yeah.
Would you? Okay, so then we can't say that this is a mere contradiction. So we have to say, okay, one must be being used metaphorically, and one must be being used literally. So that's how I would synthesize that data and say that no, I don't think any of those scriptures actually suggest that God is changing his mind, but emotions. But again,
So
I do.
how would you take a
Sorry.
data point in which God converts a unilateral promise into a conditional promise? It was a unilateral promise, but then events occurred, and then God, as a response, converts it to a conditional promise.
An example of that.
Well, do you want to before I pull it up? Do you want to speculate how you would handle that?
Okay. I would think of the Jonah example. There was no conditional. It's just I'm going to destroy you, right? I mean, that's how he said I'm going to destroy you, and then all of a sudden they meet an implied condition. Well, that's the answer right there. They meet an implied condition, and all of a sudden that judgment doesn't happen. And Jeremiah 18 is the perfect example of God being the potter. So I would say that most of these unilateral, any example I could think of, these unilateral examples are actually implicit conditional. Uh, and so they're always, I would say almost always, there's conditions in a covenant. It's just that what we call unconditional is usually God promising that these conditions will be met. So that God is saying that I'll make sure that these conditions are met. So that's basically my approach, would be saying that almost every statement is an implicit conditional statement.
It could be, but it reads. This is 1 Samuel 2:30. This is Eli's sons. So Eli's sons turn out to be pretty bad guys, and God ends up killing these guys. And he's talking to Eli, and he says, "Therefore, the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now," this is indicating some sort of change. It was unilateral. It will be forever. But now, the Lord declares, far be it from me. He's saying, this thing that I promised that was going to be forever, it's far from me. For those who honor me, I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. He's saying, I'm taking this unilateral promise that was forever and converting it into a conditional promise that only applies if you fill up your end of the bargain.
Yeah, to me, again, this, if you could pull up Jeremiah 18, that'd be helpful. This is a perfect example of Jeremiah 18, where God explicitly, same thing in Ezekiel, but Jeremiah 18 is the best passage on this. That says that I'm the potter and you're the clay, and I always have the right to, if you turn out wicked, I always have the right to come and smite you, and if you turn out good, I always have the right to restore you. So this is God emphatically saying, understand that every single one of my promises are conditional, that they're implicit condition, even if I don't state it. And so an example of this.
Why would the original promise be forever, and then why would it had to be converted to a conditional if it was a conditional all along?
No, I'm saying that there are always implicit stipulations that aren't stated. For example, when we marry, we say till death do us part. Right? We say, richer for poorer, for death do us part. I've never heard a marriage vow that says, unless you cheat on me, and if you cheat on me, you're out of here.
That was my marriage vow. No, I'm just kidding.
I hope not. That's just tacky. That's just tacky and just, it's bad company. Like, you just don't do that, right? But nevertheless, there's not most people, unless you have one of those people who believe that divorce is never permitted, but most people would recognize that no, that implicit in this is if you meet the stipulations of the covenant, which is namely that you're going to be faithful to me. If you start cheating on me and having multiple affairs, I'm not bound to this, but you don't need to state it in the initial covenant document. So I would say the same thing here, that yes, God made a statement to them that he would bless them and that they would be, his house would be with him forever. But that is that's an implicit conditional statement.
Why would he have to convert it to a conditional if it always was a conditional?
I don't think he's converting. He's just making it explicit.
He says, but now, then he says, whoever honors me, I will honor. So it goes from your house forever, and then it says, but now I say, far be it from me. So he's rejecting what he originally said. That's rejected, and it's replaced with the conditional. And so if the original had if the original had the implicit condition in it, then he wouldn't have to convert it to a conditional.
Yeah, I'd have to to look at that text again. I'm not
Yeah.
seeing that. I'm not necessarily seeing that God is saying to Eli, okay, we had an unconditional covenant here, but now I'm not so sure. So now I'm going to give you a conditional covenant, and we'll see about whether or not I'm going to judge you. I would say, no, I don't think that's what's happening in that context. More like he's saying, we had this covenant where I said I was going to bless you, but actually you turned out wicked, and your son, well, not you, Eli, per se, but your son turned out wicked, and now I'm going to smite you. And this, and now he's explaining that, basically he went off till death do us part, and now he's saying, I'm divorcing you, not because I'm suddenly unfaithful and I'm suddenly a liar. Once again, I don't know how you would understand Hebrews, where it says that God cannot lie, and by
The
unchanging things
unlying
of his,
God.
huh?
It's the unlying God. I don't think it's making
Yeah.
a metaphysical statement.
Okay, but are you saying that God can lie then?
He lies all the time in the Bible.
Oh, that's terrible. Well, I'm glad that you said it like that. I mean, but um, then if God is lying all the time in the Bible, then God is sinful. God
No,
is.
not all
I'm
lies are sins.
not. I don't. What do you mean that not all lies are sins? God says that all liars will end up uh into the lake of fire. I mean,
Yeah,
he even tells us that we shouldn't break our oaths and let our yes be yes and our no be. He even says that he's the God of truth, and falsehood is not in him. So, um,
that's true. So he doesn't lie to his people. He doesn't lie to people he loves and he's trying to protect. But if you're lying to the Nazis to protect Jews in your household, you're not sinning. You're not sinning. You see various lies throughout the Bible. The 1 Kings 22 incident is very interesting because God puts a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets, and the purpose of this is to get Ahab to go to war so it's to deceive Ahab to go to war in order for Ahab to get killed. And it's this divine courtroom scene where there's intrigue going on, where you got to lie to all the prophets to lie to the king to get him to do a certain action.
yeah. So, what you said though is that God doesn't lie to his people, but the case that we were originally talking about was Eli, who was his people. If he originally said this is an unconditional covenant,
It's
that
not a
I
lie.
make,
That's because a lie is
well,
a
he's
statement with intent to deceive. If it's only a lie if he knew all future events.
But I guess, but if what you're saying is only alive, he knew all future events. So it sounds like you're admitting that God is not saying that that there's not implicit covenant is not implicitly broken. If you don't meet conditions, then he can change his mind and not the dish out the blessing that he's promised. Which sounds like you're agreeing with me all of a sudden. Again, is that there are implicit conditions, but you're just saying that God just doesn't know that he won't meet those implicit conditional statements. And I'm just saying that God does. But the bottom line is we're both agreeing about the fact that there's implicit conditions in God's covenant promises.
Yeah, so if I tell my kids I'm going to bring them to Disneyland, knowing full well that will never happen, I'm a liar. But if I say I'm going to bring you to Disneyland and I believe it's true, and then they become naughty, and then I revoke that, I wasn't a liar when I said I was going to bring them to Disneyland. So
Yeah,
a lie,
unless
what? I'm tricking them?
unless it's a conditional statement. If you and again what you said, that it's not a lie to make a conditional statement. If then statements are not lies. As long as the only way an if then statement is a lie is if you meet the if and then you don't get the then, right? If you're not naughty, then you go to Disneyland. They're not naughty, you say I'm not taking you to Disneyland. That would be
Which
a lie. But if then statement is not a lie.
which then makes the Eli instance really good, because what if you have in the Eli situation a unilateral promise being converted to a conditional promise, that tells us that the original promise wasn't conditional, and the original promise would have been a lie if he did know the events that would happen. Just
I mean,
hypothetically,
yeah, hypothetically what?
hypothetically, let's say God knows that Eli's house would not be eternal. Hypothetically, let's say he gives them a unilateral, unconditional promise that Eli's house will be conditional or will be forever, but later on revokes it and then changes it into a conditional. In that hypothetical, God would be lying.
I'm agreeing with you that if God if God says one thing and does something else, then that would make God untrustworthy. And I mean, that's what breaking oath is, right? To say you're going to do something and then not to do it. But that's why I'm saying that I find this to be an implicit condition. And again, it sounds like to me that you also are kind of smuggling that in there, and that's the whole reason of the future when he finds out that these implicit conditions are broken. That's why God changes it all of a sudden into a conditional. But even that idea means that okay, it was always implicitly conditional. If these conditions were met, so he changed it into a conditional, means that it always was implicitly conditional.
So the Jeremiah text
Is
you brought up is very interesting because not only in the parable, God doesn't finish what he originally sets out to do. He has to remake it after the clay is marred in his hand. And the parable is interpreted, and it's interpreted if a nation, if I promise them blessings and then they turn from that, I won't do what I thought I was going to do. And then he says, if there's an evil nation that becomes good, I said I was going to destroy them, I won't do what I said I was going to do. It uses the two different words. It uses, I won't do what I thought I would do. I won't do what I said I would do. And so basically It's saying that based on unfolding events and based on changing expectations, that my promises can change.
I don't have any. But again, that's why I brought Jeremiah 18. I do want to answer your First Kings scripture that you have put up here, but that's why I brought up Jeremiah 18, because Jeremiah 18 tells us that God interacts with humanity and people in time, and so and also tells us that all of his statements, that they are implicitly conditional. God, he's saying in Jeremiah, I always have the right to respond to your actions, and so if I tell you that I have blessing for you and all of that, and you go wicked, God will not be God will strike you down. You can never try to say, well, God, you said right here, and I don't see any conditions. That will never work with God, because God is saying, I am the potter. I always have these conditions, and I always reserve for myself you if you decide to rebel against me, and I always have the right to also change my mind and forgive you if you repent. So that's why I find Jeremiah 18 to be so wonderful, because it tells us everywhere that there are implied conditions, just like we with the marriage vows, we don't give the conditions.
But the conditions are, I thought one thing and then a different thing happens. He won't do what he thought he was going to do, and he won't do what he said he was going to do.
Well, I would have to look at the thought there. I would take the thought there is his intention. The whole idea is your thoughts are your plans, right? What your intentions are. And so the idea is that these blessings that were going to flow to you because you were obedient to God, those are revoked. Just a perfect example is the Jonah incident with Nineveh. Well, that was an example of the destruction that God had planned. All of those things, those hypotheticals, they're out of the door, and now the blessing is coming down, and the reverse can happen as well. So I'm just saying that's why I take Jeremiah 18 as to be the paradigm scripture for answering a lot of these supposed changing the mind. They're not changing the mind; they're just implied conditions of being met. But I do want to answer your thing about First Kings and saying that I don't think First Kings says that God is a liar. I think First Kings says that God.
Or do you got the verse I got pulled up?
Verse 23?
Yeah. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster against you.
Yeah, certainly. But I don't deny this at all. I don't take this metaphorically. I take this absolutely literal, that God put a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets, and so that the people would listen to ironically, though, if you look at the context of this, the funny thing is, a prophet is telling the king that this has happened.
Yeah.
This isn't really a secret at all. God has said to him,
the lies have already happened. The lies have already happened.
This already happened. You've been lied to, king, and I'm telling you that I'm the one who lied to him. He doesn't listen, and then he strikes Micaiah here, and then ultimately, like an idiot, goes out to battle and dies because he ultimately doesn't believe. But no, I would have no problem with God using evil spirits, using Satan. I believe that this lying spirit's a demon here, that God permits and allows them to do things and intends, and they can't do anything outside of God's will because God is sovereign. But there's one thing for God to say to Satan, you can tempt my servant Job. It's another thing for God to go around tempting Job, and God being the agent himself, beating on Job and taking his family. Well, that's the first thing. The second thing is, go ahead.
in Job, in the last chapter, it says that God brought all that evil on Job. God is blamed as the active agent in Job's suffering.
Yes, but we know that in fact that God actually wasn't the active agent. That here God is being described as the actor because of his sovereignty and because he actively, passively permitted and handed Job over to Satan. So that's why we can find that. That's why I gave
bears responsibility, right? So like King David, he killed Uriah the Hittite, although he didn't do it himself. He didn't go murder him with a sword or anything like that. King David killed.
No, not King David. No, I thought you said God. I'm saying God might have.
Right, but in the King David incidents, King David murdered Uriah the Hittite, and King David was blamed for murder because what King David did is he authorized, he planned, he orchestrated this death. He gets the blame for the murder. You don't get off the hook if you use secondary agents.
Okay, yeah. So I thought you were talking about your Uzziah. No. With David, certainly David is to blame because he orchestrates, he plans, he sets him up, and authorized his death. But with God, this is that creator distinction that God can in fact permit and allow without him actually being the causal agent, because otherwise, God just wouldn't be sovereign. This is something that is just necessary that God has to allow and permit everything to happen. Yet the Bible continuously says that God is not the author of evil, that God is not himself the agent, God doesn't tempt anyone with evil, so forth and so on. So that's just
God will send them strong delusions, right? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's the same thing. God, I think that's probably either God withdrawing his grace, but God doesn't obligate to give you grace, right? Grace is by definition free. So God can withdraw his grace and allow you to be more hardened and get into your delusion all he wants. Or God can also, one of God's graces is maybe protecting you from demons. So if God is protecting you from demons or holding back demons so that they can't further deceive humanity, and God says, fine, you want to hate me, you want to rebel against me, you want to do all these wicked things, all right, I'm going to let the demons have more reign and control over you, then once again, God is doing that, but God is not actively the one who is tempting anyone. So I would never say that God actively tempts anyone, but I would certainly say that God can permissively allow you to be more evil, or he can allow someone else to tempt you, or demonic activity or something like that.
And so what would be a lie? God saying he's going to do something and then not do it directly? Would that be a lie?
Yeah. Well, like the Hebrews example, that God made an oath. God said promises to Abraham that he was going to to bless him and make his name great, and that his descendants were going to spread throughout all the earth. And in fact, God didn't do that. If God would to turn back on that and just decide he's not going to do that, then that would be a lie. Or if God says to Christians, here's a good one. If God says to Christians, if you will believe in my son, right, repent of your sins, believe in my son for salvation, and trust him for his finished work, you have eternal life. And then I die, stand before God, and I said, I believe in your son. I trusted him. I was a true believer. He says, yeah, I changed my mind. No, I don't really want you. I don't like curly hair. You have black curly hair. That's it. I've decided black curly hair is the stipulation for hell. You're out of here. I mean, that would make God a liar, right? Then God would be untrustworthy and untrue to his word. And so that would, in fact, be a lie from God, which far be it from God. I don't think God is ever going to do that. God is the non-lying God. God is incapable of lying. He's not going to lie to us.
So I think in the 1 Kings 22 situation, God is holding a court. He says, you go lie. It says that God has put lying spirits in the mouth of all these prophets. I don't see how you could just make a distinction. Oh, he didn't do it himself. I don't think that's going to absolve him of culpability for these lies, as if he's not the one orchestrating, committing these lies, and carrying out this entire situation.
Yeah, I would say it certainly does. I give it, and actually, if you look right up there, it says, and the Lord said to him, well, actually, before that, he says, what shall we do? And then verse 21, then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord saying, I will entice him. The spirit saying, I got a plan, God. I know what to do. I will lie. And the Lord agrees and said, all right, go and be the lying spirit. I'll give an example of the difference. So imagine that you come home and you, maybe I don't want to put this on you, right? Imagine a man comes home. A man comes home and he looks at his cell phone and he's told his wife that he's going on a business trip on the weekend. And he looks at his cell phone and he sees communication from his wife to his neighbor, saying that my husband said that that he's going on a business trip, and then we can get together as soon as he leaves. And so you see this communication, and so you tell your wife, you know what? Actually, my you decide to reschedule your work schedule or whatever, and say, you know what? Actually, I don't need to leave on the weekend. I'm leaving tonight, and then you leave tonight, but then you actually don't leave tonight, and then you wait for her and you watch her to go out and commit adultery, and then you confront her, and so forth and so on. You had full knowledge of this, right? You even set up some of the scenarios to orchestrate the event, and even got out of the way to allow this event to happen. But no, I don't think anyone in their right mind would blame you for the incident, like that you were somehow responsible for the adultery that occurred in that situation.
But I'd be responsible for the lie, right?
You say what?
I'd be responsible if I'm in the situation you set up. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You want to call that a lie?
I lie to my wife by saying I'm going to leave right now on my business trip, and then I don't.
Yeah, well, potentially, you can break down that analogy. Maybe he does actually leave on the business trip, if you want to call that a lie. Maybe you can say that wasn't a lie, that was using deception, and you can say that was a justified act of deception. Okay, maybe when I go that route or not. My point is him getting out of the way and allowing her evil intention doesn't make him morally culpable for the sexual infidelity that she does. While if he instead contacts the neighbor, who is apparently the most attractive man in the world, right, and then refuses to come together with his wife for months, and then contacts the neighbor to come over there. You see what I'm saying? If he's orchestrating the event,
right,
where he's getting the wife to all of a sudden want the neighbor and trying to pay off the neighbor to commit adultery, then all of a sudden that he's much more culpable. He's now culpable for the action.
So I don't see practically how this distinctions you're trying to make are very helpful. So let's say that God's unlying, he can't tell a lie, but he uses other people to tell lies for him, and instead that he commands to go do, and then they do it, then he doesn't get the blame or whatever. He tells the writers of Hebrews to write these things about him, but he's telling the writer of Hebrews to lie. So
what writer of Hebrews to lie? What do you mean by that?
Okay, in the scenario, in the hypothetically, he told Paul to lie. Hypothetically, he told all the 12 disciples to lie. The whole Bible is now lies. God's still unlying, but since he used intermediary means to lie to us, then what?
I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not simply a hand in a glove. It's not simply that God is the one. Even in this case, God did not say, I need a liar. Where can I get me a liar? He did not say that. In fact, he just had a divine counsel. And this evil spirit stands forward and says, I will accomplish your will by destroying this wicked king. And I'll do it by being a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. And the God says, I will allow you to do that. So God allows this demonic spirit to do the lying, is not the same as God telling the lying spirit to lie. This is an act of active permission, is what I'm saying. God knows about it. The demon has to get permission, and then God allows the demon to do it. But God himself is not the lying spirit. That's the distinction I'm making.
Now, therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster against you. It seems like the writer of Kings is definitely attributing this to God.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with that. And what I'm saying is we find this is how I explain many scriptures like this that talk about that give an active role for God. But then as you study the text, just like with the Job example, you realize, oh, God was not nearly as active as I thought. The activity of God was his active permission to allow Satan to do it. The activity of God here, even though it's being described to God as actively doing, it's actually not God actively doing it. God is actively permitting. The only action that God is doing actively is this active permission. But this is, to me, this is a perfect example of God permitting, and then the authors of the Bible saying that God actively did it because they see his permissive act to be an active action of God.
Yeah, I see it as like a David Uriah situation. The writers of the Bible understand that culpability and blame and responsibility isn't mitigated by having intermediate actors, and whoever's orchestrating the situation ultimately gets the blame. Is how I'm reading this, and how it seems to me to be the more natural reading, if that makes sense.
I see what you're saying. I just think with the example, David is actively to do his will, and he's using them like gloves. David is not permitting things to happen. Uh, David is actively causing those things to happen and getting them to do. And I don't see that happening with God. That's number one. And number two is I don't know how you can necessarily escape this. God may not be omnipotent to you, but I'm sure he's powerful. And God might
Yeah.
not know all things, but I'm sure he knows some things. I think he knows many things. And so God has the resources and the power to prevent a lot of things. And God knows about a lot of things. And yet a lot of wickedness happens. So if you're not willing to make this distinction that God can permit things to happen and himself not to be culpable, then I don't see how you escape God being culpable for every single wicked act that he knows about, which presumably is a whole lot of them, if that
Well,
makes sense.
the writers of the Psalms sure think God's culpable for a lot of evil. They say, "You're righteous. They suffer all day long. Why do you hide your face, Lord?" They call him to account. Job calls God to account, saying, "Look at the things that are going on here. The wicked prosper, and me, the innocent person, all the sufferings coming upon me." So he seems to try to call God to account as well. It seems to be almost the natural theology of the writers of the Bible that sometimes if the wickedness is happening and God's not stepping in, then God does share some of the culpability in that wickedness that does happen.
Yeah, I mean, I would say with Job that Job feels that natural inclination, and the Bible's so real to us. It shares the actual experience of God's people, like Job, like the psalmist. Everyone is operating from a perspective that God is all sovereign. This would be you talked about the scriptures are not written by Calvinists. I would say, well, yes, they are, and this actually, and everyone actually naturally. You said everyone is open theist. I would say everyone is naturally Calvinistic in this way, believing in the sovereignty of God. That's why when they kick their toe, they blame God. Well, what did God have to do with it? I mean, do people really think that God is actively causing? No, they recognize that God is sovereign in control of all things, and so they are ascribing this to God. But ultimately, with Job, when he's confronted by God, says that he repents in ashes and sackcloth. He realizes that he doesn't know what he's talking about, and that he has no right to judge God. And so, same thing in that passage of Malachi we went to. These people are saying it's vain, and God is saying, no, 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 wait. You're saying it's vain now, but when you see the fullness of judgment, you won't be having that kind of a declaration. So I think that ultimately God will make all rights wrong. And in the end, when his judgment is meted out, we won't have these accusations against God and think that God was morally culpable for the evil that he committed. That's what I'm arguing, that God is not morally culpable, and God will bring all of acts to justice. And again, I don't think you disagree. Would you say that God is morally culpable for the murders that happened on earth, that God is guilty by association because he allowed the murders to happen?
In some sense, Jeremiah 12:1, "Righteous are you, O Lord, when I plead with you, but let me talk to you about your judgments. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why are those happy who deal so treacherously? You have planted them, yes, they have taken root, but they grow, yes, they bear fruit, and you are near in their mouth, but far from their mind." And so, yeah, he says, "Yeah, you're righteous, God, but let me criticize you. Let me ask you about how you're handling the affairs of this world. Why is this situation? Why does it exist, Lord?" And so
Yeah,
you can't just throw off all blame for your creation. You create something, you are somewhat culpable for it. I think we see this play out, especially in Genesis 6, where God blames himself. God's not repenting of the people becoming wicked. The repentance is specifically described of God's own action. God repented that he had made man. It's not saying, "Oh, I'm sorry that they've become so wicked." He's repenting of his own actions. He's blaming himself for the situation that has occurred.
yeah. I mean, I just would ultimately we talked about Genesis 6. I would say that that's a description of God's great sorrow and grief that humanity's gone wicked. I would say Jeremiah is talking from an earthly phenomenological perspective. We find that throughout the Bible that he's describing how he feels that the wicked are prospering, the wicked are not being judged, and he's frustrated with this. But as we understand this holistically from the Bible, we see the answer to the theodicy. The answer to this is God's final judgment and God's day of accounting. That one
That
day that
that
all
is
wrongs
yeah,
right.
that is what they point to. But we shouldn't be condemning this type of speech. This is normal accepted speech in Israelite theology. It finds its way into the Bible very explicitly. A God blaming himself in Genesis. Let's say it's figurative. It's just pointing to his great sorrow. The language as written points to a self reevaluation. And so we shouldn't condemn that type of speech about God. We shouldn't say, oh, he's above these categories that are normally attributed to God throughout the text.
I mean, we're just ultimately disagreeing. It sounds like you're again assuming, which is fair, but you're assuming that your interpretation is correct, and I'm saying that I don't think that if the underlining theology, which I'm finding in the Bible, is in fact that that God does not change in his moral character, and that God does know the future, right? If we can just hypothetically, if we do know that God does know the future and that his moral character doesn't change, then I believe that you would probably reconcile these scriptures the same way that I reconcile these scriptures, of realizing that they're figurative descriptions describing God's moral sorrow or whatever, but not meant to be taken to teach metaphysical claims. That's what ultimately I'm arguing, and that's how I'm systematizing the Bible. And one thing that does give me comfort, and this kind of begins at the beginning of our conversation, is I'm not alone here. I'm not the only Christian who's
Yeah.
ever uh, come to these conclusions, right? I stand in a rich tradition of exegetes that have also reconciled the Bible in this way. So I'm not standing in isolation from the church, and I am seeing this. I'm not just relying merely on the church. I'm trying to systematize the Bible. I'm not trying to twist it, and I know you might feel I am twisting ultimately, but I'm not trying to twist the Bible. I'm just trying to harmonize how, if God does know the future and God is unchangeably good, like James says, for example, that he doesn't change like the sun and all of that, but he's every good gift comes from God and he's unchangeably
There's no
so.
shadow
If that's
turning.
true,
Yeah.
then exactly. If that's true, then how do I understand this language found in Genesis 6? And I would say you would understand it as a metaphor for God's suffering.
Oh, I could appreciate your reading. I could appreciate a use of some sort of metaphor that communicates some sort of truth, which is it's not typical with Calvinist exegesis. Like John Calvin writes that it's just baby talk, God mumbling sweet nothings to us, basically. Because even God having those emotions, communicating deep emotional reactions to things, tends to invalidate classical conceptions of unchangingness, immutability, divine simplicity, God being above predicates. It tends to negate a lot of that classical theism. And so I could appreciate your perspective. I could appreciate how you're reading the text. And I don't disagree that a lot of the texts that we're dealing with can be read in those alternate senses. But I think ultimately the narrative takes precedence. If there's an event that happens in a narrative, and that event explains the narrative, it explains motivations, it explains twists that happen within the narrative, and especially in the Exodus 32 case, where you have future commentators echoing not this spiritual reading of it, where it's a divine setup for Moses' sake. Maybe I'm not attributing that to you. I'm not saying that that's what a lot of people say, that this was all for Moses' sake. This was all to prayer is not for us. Prayer doesn't change us. Or prayer is not for God. Prayer doesn't change God, but prayer changes us is a pretty common claim. They don't seem to take that position from looking back on those texts, the future commentators.
Yeah, yeah. I certainly I wouldn't. James says that you have not because you ask not. That's not changing God. That's changing you. It changes things that you have. So I certainly don't think that. I think prayer does change you, though. By the way, if you ask God to send out workers to the harvest, often God will, tap on your shoulder and say, "I'm sending you." And so, yes, prayer does in fact change you, but it doesn't merely change you. It changes other people's circumstances. It changes the world out there. It changes all kinds of various things. As far as classical theism and strong views of simplicity and strong views of immutability, it's often difficult to wade through that literature and exactly what they're saying. Some people will say they'll make some statements that sound very strongly like they deny that God has any emotions at all, and then they will say, what God has as what we have as passions, God has as perfections. Well, perfect what? perfect love. So sometimes you have to get through what they're saying, and they're actually not ultimately denying that God has love. They're just saying that God's love is analogous to our love. Our love is imperfect. God has perfect love. So I would say just we have to wade through that literature and to be patient with them and say, what precisely are you saying? But I am agreeing ultimately that I think that simply waving this language away and saying, "Oh, this is just God baby talking," and that's unsatisfying. There's something more is going on in Genesis than simply sounding like a man, but not meaning to say what it says. But I am saying that as we think through these metaphors, they're not that difficult. Like God smelling the sweet aroma of the burnt offerings. I don't think that it's supposed to communicate that God has a nose. It's not that challenging to figure out, okay, what does smelling the pleasing aroma mean? It means that God is satisfied. God knows and experiences and receives and enjoys the worship of his people. Same thing with God's eyes burn against the wicked. What does that mean? Does it mean he has eyeballs? No, it means that God sees and he's angry at the wicked. So it's the same thing if you go into that Genesis 6 passage. It's full of sorrow. It says that God was sorry that he made man, right? And he relented that he made him. So it's not like some wild speculation that this is supposed to be describing God's great sorrow. You just look around the text and think through the metaphor of sorrow, and it becomes apparent of what that meaning is supposed to be.
But what's the object of his sorrow? What is he sorry about? It's his own actions.
I don't see that. I think that he is so sorrowful about the evilness of humanity. He's greatly anguished about how wicked humanity has come, and that is likened to a human being creating something and it going bad. Right. And then if someone created something and it went bad, you'd feel such great sorrow because that you created this thing that destroyed thousands and thousands of lives. And that sorrow and anguish is how what's being pictured as God to describe how much God feels bad about how much God is in pain because of the wickedness of humanity.
You might say in some sense he's responsible.
I don't think responsibility is supposed to be communicated here.
I know. I was just hitting you from the side there, like. But the language here is very open theistic. I mean, yeah, it might be metaphorical. The Lord saw the wickedness, so it's describing maybe a visual communication on the face value. There might be a metaphor. It might be it's like trying to communicate something else. He sees the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intention of the thought of his heart was on only evil continually. Then the Lord regretted he had made man on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So it's this double situation where he regretted it and it grieved him. What did he regret? That he regretted man being made, that he made man. And so the Lord said, I will blot out man. So then it turns into a first person narrative. Not only does the narrator say it, but God says it. I will blot out man who I have created from the face of the land, man, animals, creeping things, birds of heaven, for I am sorry that I have made them. And so there's the narrator, there's God. It's saying it 3 times over. It seems like God is legitimately regretting his own actions.
Yeah, I mean, you can take it that way if you take it on in that literal way. I'm just saying that this idea of regret results in deep sorrow and anguish is recognizable by anyone who's ever dealt with regret. And even in this language, we have right after it says that the Lord regretted in verse 6, it said it grieved him in his heart. So right here, I'm not just making up that there's a connection between regretting and grieving. The text says that. And then if you look in verse 7, it says that the Lord will blot man from the earth. So he's going to wipe out humanity, for I am sorry that I made him. So once again, this connection of regretting and grieving and sorry is right there on the text. That God
True.
is anguishing.
What's he sorry about?
He's huh?
What's the reason he's sorry? What is he sorry about?
He's sorry that humanity has become this wicked and this evil. But I don't think that in any sense that he is surprised that humanity has become this wicked and evil. And one reason that we know that wouldn't be the case is because back in Genesis chapter 3, he's the one who said that there's going to be this seed of Satan who is going to attack the seed of the woman. And eventually the seed of the woman is going to crush the seed of Satan. So how is God confused that humanity is going to turn out wicked if he's already prophesied and communicated that there's going to be this long line of the seed of the serpent that's going to be wiping out the seed of the woman, who's ultimately going to be defeated by Christ. I just doesn't
Because
that doesn't make any sense.
that's not a Christological prophecy, is the answer. But it says that the God it grieved him in his heart that he has made man. So it tells us the reason that he's regretting his own actions in creation of man.
Well, I want to go back there. You said that's not a Christological passage. What would you take that as?
Well, number one, Satan is not described anywhere in the Bible as being the serpent in Genesis 3. You don't find that connection, and so it has to be assumed on the text that this is not just a talking serpent, which is it's not explicit in the text that this is anything but a talking serpent. And then the explicit language is what normal Jews will take this as this is just about animosity between man and serpent, which is pretty historical, that, serpents and men don't get along.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you say that. Certainly, I would say that Revelation identifies the serpent of old as Satan.
I think that's a
I think
reference
that
to Isaiah. There's a reference to the serpent and the dragon. And then you see the same
yeah.
reference in Revelation. So I think it's referencing Rahab the sea monster rather than this Genesis 3 serpent.
Yeah, I mean that's possible. I think that there might be multiple connections that the Rahab and the sea monster and Isaiah is also alluding back to Genesis, and
Maybe.
Revelation is alluding back to both.
But you don't find it
Um,
contextually in Genesis 3. You don't find any indication this is a Satan or Satan.
I would say the very fact that he's speaking gives high suggestion that this is a serpent that is functioning more than just simply an animal, but that this animal is being possessed by some kind of spiritual thing that's causing it to be able to speak. And we also see that the demons talk through men in the New Testament. Well, Jesus has a famous conversation with a legion of demons, and so it's not the man who's speaking; it's the demon speaking. So it's not unprecedented for demons to be in the host of creatures, right? They even get into pigs. So we know not only can demons get into humans, but they can also get into animals. And at least we have cases where they're in the human, they're allowed to speak through it.
So how about in the Balaam situation in which his horse talks to him? The horse seems
Yeah,
to be the rational actor in the speaking incident there and not being possessed.
I think that's a good counterexample. So there's some kind of uh, miraculous experience that God is opening and doing something miraculous there with the donkey so that the donkey can speak. So I agree with you that it's theoretically possible that God, through some miraculous ability, could cause an animal to speak. But I'm just saying that I think that the very fact that it's speaking suggests that some supernatural realities is happening there. And
And
that's not
it,
that's very much compatible with demonic activity.
right. So in Genesis 3:1, the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field. It seems to be being numbered among the beasts. And so, my little aside there was it's not clear that this is a Christological prophecy. You don't find real indications that Satan's even acting in this passage. And so that's a real possibility we need to examine. And it's not a good counter argument against Genesis 6 being God regretting making man and then wiping out all of mankind.
Well, I mean, I would say that if your interpretation is correct, it wouldn't be a good counter argument. But I would say the mass majority of Christians, and even the New Testament, picks up this language of treading on serpents and scorpions and so forth, and treading on the head of Satan. That, and even the seed of woman, and identifying as an individual. I would say the mass majority of Christians. I mean, you applied to some Jewish commentators, which Paul himself says the veil is over their eyes. They just refuse to see what is there in the text. If we see the events of Jesus Christ, it's very hard not to see this scripture as, in fact, a prophecy of Jesus crushing the head of the serpent. And let me say one other thing. Jesus says that the serpent, that people are children of the devil. John makes a big deal about this. The people are the children of the devil or the children of of God, right? And we even have two genealogies in Genesis, one tracing what seems to be the seed of the serpent, which is Cain's line, and then Seth's line. So while I agree with you that this might not be an absolute drag out, knockdown case, I would say that I think nevertheless, most Christians would in fact see that this is in fact a Christological passage, and this passage does predict opposition between two lines, which in fact I think you would agree does in fact happen. The rest of the Bible clarifies that is what happens, and so it's hard for me to believe then if this is all correct. I know you dispute that. Then somehow God is then confused and surprised all of a sudden that humanity is wicked when He's already predicted that would be the case here.
So I would say that traditional scholarship on the Old Testament will see Genesis 6 as God learning about mankind. He states the reason He's going to destroy them is that He finds that they're evil, they have evil intents on their heart, and that's the reason the whole world's destroyed. Then after the flood, the reason that He's going to never again destroy mankind is for the exact same reason, that He learns that they are evil from their youth. It seems to be God recalculating and learning about mankind and then lowering His standards in response to this newfound knowledge about mankind.
Yeah, I don't really. I mean, what is God learning? I mean, how did God all of a sudden come to realize? I mean, He's had thousands, I believe at this point, thousands of years of human history and seen but millions potentially of people being born and seeing them be wicked from conception on. I don't know how all of a sudden God is figuring out that man is wicked before that, and I really don't see that. I see that the reason why God doesn't destroy humanity is because God still has a plan, namely to save a people through Christ. And speaking, this almost makes it sound like that you don't think that Christ was foreknown before the foundation of the world, and that Christ was the plan from the beginning to save all of humanity. Because if He is, I don't know how you're kind of making these statements. It sounds like Christ is a major plan B for you instead of being plan A, if all of a sudden he wants to wipe out humanity, and that's what He wanted to do.
Yeah, the phrase is katabole cosmos, downthrowing of the universe, downthrowing of the world, which could refer to the creation of the universe. It could refer to the fall of Adam. It could refer to the Genesis 6 narrative. And so it's really dangerous to take a phrase and then just try to apply a specific meaning on it without examining possible meanings of what it means.
So just to be clear, you would take the foundation of the world, that he does these things from the foundation of the world, would be that at Genesis 6, that now He's deciding to save humanity through Christ?
That's a very real possibility. It could have been a plan after the fall in Genesis as well. But again, everything's conditional. If you wipe out of all of humanity, then you don't have to implement that type of plan. These are possibilities. I'm not saying that anyone has to side with any single possibility. Or the language in the New Testament, a lot of times people use hyperbolic statements. Paul says, these people knew me from the beginning. And he's not saying these people knew me from the beginning of all the world that's ever happened. And he uses the word foreknowledge about people. He's just saying these guys have known me for a long time. And so you got to be very careful with language, assigning hard and fast meanings to it when there's other possibilities that are available to us.
Yeah, I would say that language is always kind of slippery that way, and there's always a plethora of possibilities. But when you have a multiplicity of scriptures that continue to be seemingly to communicate the same thing, that you have a multiplicity of scriptures that say God laid the foundation of the world, for example. And then you have other scriptures that seem to be saying that God has chose us before the foundation of the world, or Christ was the lamb slain before the foundation of the world, or Christ was foreknown before the foundation of the world. And you just have this compiling of scriptures. It seems to be bringing clarity to what it's meaning. So one scripture all alone, there's less clarity. But when you compile this and bring it all together, you start systematizing it and coming to a better conclusion.
See, there's even conflation going on in what you just said, because like the Revelation passages use the word apo, since, and they don't use the word pro before. And there's passages that talk about all the prophets which have been slain since the foundation of the world. And what that means is all the prophets who've ever been killed. And that's what it means, using apo, from the foundation of the world, or since the foundation of the world. And those prepositional phrases in Revelations, it's pretty clear it's referring not to Jesus who is slain. That's part of the book, the book of Christ slain. It's referring to the names not written, because we get two instances of the same phrase, and in one you have the lamb slain, and in one it's missing. But you still have the since the foundation of the world in both those passages, and the names not written. So more likely that prepositional phrase is not referring to Christ being slain since the foundation of the world.
Yeah, I'd have to look at that. I know the word appa actually means from, not sense. Now, contextually, it may have a meaning of sense, but the actual plain meaning of that preposition is from. So I still don't see how that disputes what I said, which was I actually used that very phrase, from the foundation of the world. But yeah, we could look at maybe that passage sometime. But I'm just saying that the preposition you just gave me, you just said the word opera means sense, and I'm saying that actually the word opera in its plain meaning means from. That's its standard.
Prepositions have wide semantic ranges of meaning. And so that's why I gave that Luke passage as an example. All the prophets slain since the foundation of the world, apo. And so it's not
too, though. It'd be fine just to say from the foundation of the world. Like there's no reason not to just say from the. I mean, you can say since, but
you
I don't
can say
see
from them till now. From then till now. Since they're synonyms.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So I don't know. I don't have the passage in front of me, and I've heard this argument before, so I would need to look into it more carefully. I'm not disputing you per se, but I'm just saying that the word from, appa, itself just means from, and so I would have to look more closely of what exactly your argument you're making. It sounds like your argument more is not that it's the word sense, but more that the word appa is connected to something other than Christ being slain from the foundation of the world. But the preposition is connected to being written in the book somehow, which you might be right. I would just need to look into that more carefully. So
being not written, about names not written.
No, not written from the foundation more. Real quick, and then it's getting a little late.
Yeah.
Can we probably close it? I've enjoyed. I'd love to talk to you some more.
Yeah. No, this is a good conversation. You're my guy. I like you. As I said, we're best friends. That's what I started this whole conversation out with. No, I think this has been a productive conversation. I think you're a very rational person. I think you're very intelligent. I am very impressed. I like you. You're my guy.
Well, I'm very impressed with you, and that's why I look down and it's 12 o'clock. I'm like, wow, I need to get to bed. I hate to end the conversation like that, but I just ultimately do, and hopefully we can talk again. But again, I did something way long ago that I did is I was asking about libertarian free will, and you just said basically the choice to do otherwise, which sounds like you are affirming libertarian free will is causal choice, that in a situation you could do A or not A, and there's no sufficient cause of why you choose A or not A, and so, but the problem with this is then you start saying statements like God knows the character of Peter and he's able to predict his actions, or as I point out, you don't even need to be God. You just be a human being, and you can see that people's actions are highly predictable. Yeah. And very rarely do people make unpredictable decisions. And I don't know how that fits with this countercausal ability to choose, because it does sound like we do make choices based on our character, based on our desire of who we are. So our actions are not arbitrary. Our actions are, in fact, in continuity with our persons.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. People are highly predictable, especially in mass. It's hard to predict individual actions on an individual level unless you really know the person. But claiming someone has free will does not mean that they just act sporadically and irrationally. In fact, people tend to act in very rational, calculated ways that are very predictable. But how you'd really test to whether or not there is actually this element of free will is God surprised? If God knows all present truths, and God is surprised sometimes by how people act, that means there's genuine free will. That would be our test claim to see if the Bible actually supports the notion of free will.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would also say things, obviously, open theism and about God's omniscience and all of that. Um, yeah, it doesn't sound like the free will is necessarily as big of a case for you. It seems to be other um, uh, open theists. Free will is a major reason why people are becoming become open theists in that way, because they're desperately trying to make God have them. Human beings have categorical ability to choose otherwise, and they feel like God knowing the future would somehow inhibit that. So anyway, it is.
One last point, and then we can wrap up. I don't want to keep you up too late, but throughout the Bible, one of God's methods of knowing is often tied to his testing. God tests them to see what they will do. God will leave the pagan nations in the land of Israel to test them to see if they're going to follow him or not. That type of language is used.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, certainly that language is used in the Bible. Again, I would understand that as phenomenological language. And to me, it's not just anthropomorphic language that we find, but phenomenological is a very important category, which is that things are uh, describes their experience from humanity. So oftentimes the perspective isn't from God's, you know, divine beyond perspective, which we have no idea what it's like, which wouldn't make any sense to us. Often, the perspective we find in the Bible is actually from an earthly level, a human perspective. And so certainly from a human perspective, in time, we're tested and we're seen of whether we'll do X or Y. But and that's how things flesh out here on the earth is what I'm ultimately arguing. And again, I see that God's not only outside of time, but he's in time and he interacts with us in time. And so that's kind of the main thing I want to kind of communicate to you is what in the beginning of the conversation and throughout, you almost kept suggesting that since I believe that God knows the future, somehow it's like almost fatalism, that it's not open and we don't make any real choice, real relationship with God. And I just don't see how any of that actually follows. I think we very much can have this open because we are creating the future by the decisions that we make. It's just that God knows what decisions that we are going to make. But that doesn't make the future not open. Just like when we end here and this becomes a recording, just because it's fixed doesn't mean that what we did was not open while we were doing it. Does
So
that make sense?
philosophy is probably a different conversation that we could have, whether or not knowing the future fates that future to happen. And I'd be happy to have that conversation with you. But we probably don't got time for that. I would argue that if we're going to be talking philosophy, that the type of knowledge that you ascribe to God, in which it's 100% knowledge that of true propositions that cannot be falsified, that does make a fatalistic future. That must happen. Not even God can subvert the future in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's a difference between a fixed future, though, and I would say the difference is that a fixed future just means that it will necessarily happen because that is what happened, right? I mean, you can't if I'm going to do something, then I can't not do what I'm going to do because then I didn't do it. If that makes sense.
But there's no other
But
possibility.
well, no, there are plenty of possibilities. There were plenty of possibilities. It's just that those other possibilities were not actualized, and so those
The,
other possibilities all remain as contingent possibilities.
a possibility has to have a chance of happening, and this knowledge that you're ascribing to God is eternal, ungenerated knowledge that's with God from all eternity, right? Not even
Yeah, well,
God
we don't
can
really.
subvert.
Well, the problem is we don't even understand what any of that really means. I mean, just to be honest, we have no idea what really that actually means. We're trying to. God says, "My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts," and we're pretending like we understand what an eternal divine perspective is, which we have absolutely no idea of what an eternal divine perspective is. So certainly, God knows all things from eternity past, but we have no idea how God does know those things. It's just completely mysterious to us. But nevertheless, what God knows is the things that he will permit and allow us to do is really what I'm arguing. And so, no, it's not true that we don't have possibilities. Possibilities and contingent realities are there. They just will always be possibilities and contingent realities because we didn't choose them. right? Because we didn't actualize them, will always be true, just like in the past. Again, back to the past. There are contingent realities in the past. They just were contingent and possibilities instead of actualized. And what actually happened is the necessary truth because it necessarily did occur in that sense. But those modal statements are always still true, is what I would say.
Not with a God outside of time, in which all events are always foreknown from time eternity in his mind. There's no possibility. There is no scenario in which anything other than what actualizes actually actualizes.
Yeah, again, I would challenge you to say God outside of time. What is that? What do you even mean by that?
I think it's a nonsense statement, so I don't think God's outside of time.
Well, I'm glad you think it's a nonsense. Well, I'm not glad you think it's a nonsense statement. I'm glad that you're wrestling with this and seeing that it just simply saying that as if we know what that means is a gross miscalculation of what time is. We are spatio-temporal creatures that can only think in finite categories. So pretending like we can get from a timeless perspective and then say what necessarily follows from that, to me is gross. Again, but it's just not true. We just don't know what timeless reality is because we're temporal creatures.
Right. You talked about the type of knowledge that God has. God has knowledge that he doesn't accumulate new propositions. So these propositions are basically timeless propositions that cannot be falsified. There's no possibility of them not actualizing the way they are eternally foreknown. The type of omniscience you ascribe to God is a fatalistic omniscience that must happen.
No, I'm saying that God knows all propositions. God knows all truth. But I'm also saying I don't know how God knows all truth. He just does.
But he doesn't gain this truth at some point. There's no point in history where he gains this truth. Like he's not sitting around saying, how am I going to create the world? And then he decides how he's going to create the world, because that's him making free actions that are not foreknown, creating new things that to add to his knowledge.
Once again, I would be very careful about saying I know how God operates in the realm outside of the spatio-temporal reality. I just don't know that. I'm not saying that God doesn't sit around and think about things. I have no idea. I'm just saying, I'm epistemic humility here. I have no idea what God in his transcendent reality is doing. And I can't possibly know that is my point. And I'm saying not only can I not possibly know that, but nobody can possibly know what that is. We just know that God is timeless, but that's it. I can say nothing about timeless reality and what necessarily follows timeless reality. None of that makes any sense. And none of that actually fleshes out because we don't know what timeless reality is. Timeless reality is merely a negation of time-bound reality, but that's all it is. We don't know anything about what that entails.
But you already gave me a lot of your data sets. God doesn't gain any knowledge in any sense, and these propositions that he knows can't not occur. They can't be falsified. Or else God wouldn't know it.
Oh, yes, but some of those propositions that he knows are the things that he will do, like actualize the world, right? So it can't be falsified because he's going to do it, namely actualize the world. So some of those propositions...
That doesn't change my argument.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Maybe I'm too tired to understand.
That's why I said this is probably a different conversation, because it'd probably go like an hour or two in itself. Probably
okay,
not.
Maybe we'll talk about that next time. How exactly God having omniscience somehow leads ultimately to fatalism, even if I say I don't know how God, and it's mysterious to me how God knows the future, and you're saying nevertheless that ultimately leads to fatalism. I'm not necessarily following, right? Arminians aren't following, Calvinists aren't following, so
Calvinists
I'm not alone here.
Agree with me typically.
Calvinists typically agree with you when it comes to libertarian free will. It comes to that actions cannot be this countercausal actions cannot be arbitrary and yet known, and that's a different argument. And I'm somewhat impressed with that, but not fully persuaded by that argument. So I'm willing to be persuaded by that, but anyways, that's a different conversation. Well, brother, it's been you've been wonderful. You've been very kind to me. Had a wonderful time. Hopefully,
we'll definitely have to talk again. This is great.
Yeah. So you have we'll contact each other. Can I close in prayer?
Yes, absolutely.
Dear Heavenly Father, God, I thank you for allowing us to have this conversation. I ask, God, that we would be have shown that Christians can discuss these things and talk about them and not be nasty, not be rude, not be disrespectful to each other. God, I ask that you would help us to believe truth. If you do not know the future, if you don't have these classical attributes, God, we want to know, and we don't want to believe that. But if you do have these attributes, we don't want to discard them. We don't want to radically rethink you. We want to believe who you are, God. We want to know who you are. So please help us to know who you are, to believe who you are, and to love the God who saved us. That's what we want. We want to know you and love you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank
Amen.
you very much for the
Thank you.
conversation. All right. We'll have to do it
Talk
again.
to you. Okay. Bye-bye.
All
God
right.
bless.
Bye.